They found the answers. Then they burned them. Across every continent, in every era, humanity has left behind wounds in the historical record, gaps so precise, so deliberate, they almost feel intentional. A city swallowed by sand with its dinner table still set. A manuscript written in a language no living soul has ever decoded. A mass grave dated centuries before the civilization that supposedly built it. Someone knew. Someone always knew. For the next 3 hours, we're pulling back the curtain on the cases that rewrote everything. Quietly, without headlines. Let's begin. Imagine standing on the southwestern coast of Greenland. The wind cuts sideways off the ice sheet, carrying with it a silence so complete it feels almost imposed. The land here is raw, gray rock, brittle grass, and fjords that carve deep into the earth like old wounds. It is beautiful in the way that places untouched by warmth tend to be. Now imagine that somewhere beneath that silence, entire farms once stood. Cattle lowed in the cold air, children ran between longhouses, fires burned through the polar night. A community, small, stubborn, and remarkably alive, had carved a life out of one of the most inhospitable edges of the known world. And then, sometime around the mid-1300s, they were simply gone. The Norse had arrived in Greenland around 985 AD, led by the exiled explorer Eric the Red, who, with either extraordinary optimism or deliberate deception, named this frozen landmass something green enough to attract settlers. 2 colonies took root, the eastern settlement near modern-day Qaqortoq, and the western settlement, positioned further up the coast, closer to the Arctic Circle. At its peak, the western settlement housed perhaps 1,000 people across dozens of farms. They raised livestock, traded walrus ivory with European markets, maintained a church, and endured winters that would have broken most civilizations entirely. By all accounts, they were not failing. They were functioning, which makes what happened next so deeply strange. When Norwegian priest Ivar Bårdsen visited the western settlement around 1350, he found it empty. Not abandoned in the way of a slow, recorded decline. Empty. The livestock were still there, cattle and sheep wandering untended across the farmsteads. No bodies, no signs of mass burial, no scorched earth suggesting violence or raid. Just absence. Mainstream historians point to a convergence of pressures. The onset of the Little Ice Age, which shortened growing seasons and thickened the sea ice that connected Greenland to European trade routes. The collapse of the walrus ivory market, undermined by elephant ivory from Africa. Soil degradation from over-farming. These are credible, well-researched explanations. And yet, they explain a slow death. A community that fades, farm by farm, family by family. They do not explain livestock wandering alive through empty buildings. Some researchers have pointed toward conflict with the Thule people, the ancestors of modern Inuit, who were migrating southward through Greenland during this same period. Archaeological evidence does show the 2 cultures overlapping in the western settlement's territory. Whether that overlap was cooperative, tense, or violent remains genuinely unclear. No Norse account of direct conflict survives. No Inuit oral tradition conclusively describes a confrontation with the Norse settlers either. Others have proposed something quieter, and in some ways more haunting, that the settlers simply left. That faced with starvation, isolation, and a Europe that had largely forgotten them, they made a collective decision to walk away. To sail south, to integrate into indigenous communities, or attempt a desperate crossing back to Iceland or Norway. Could an entire settlement vanish not through death, but through choice? There are no records of their arrival anywhere else. No DNA evidence yet confirmed. No graves that tell a final story. The Western settlement sits in that uncomfortable space that history occasionally produces. A place where the evidence is real, the timeline is documented, and the people were absolutely there. And then weren't. What does it mean when an entire community disappears and leaves the fires cold but the animals breathing? What were they running from? Or running toward? The ice has kept its answer for nearly 7 centuries now. Some mysteries live in the ice. Others live in the mud. We move now from the frozen silence of Greenland to the flat, gray marshlands of eastern England, a landscape so unremarkable at first glance that you might drive past it without a second thought. Reeds, shallow water, sky pressing down low and heavy. But the Wash, that wide, square bight the North Sea takes out of the English coastline between Lincolnshire and Norfolk, has been holding a secret for over 800 years, and it may be holding it still. The year is 1216. England is at war with itself. King John, perhaps the most despised monarch in English history, the man forced to sign Magna Carta just a year earlier, the king his own barons had invited a French prince to replace, is making a desperate military march across the country. He is ill. He is losing. And he is traveling with something extraordinary. The royal baggage train, the accumulated wealth of the English crown. Crowns, scepters, jeweled swords. Coronation regalia passed down through generations of kings. Reliquaries containing sacred objects. Gold plate, silver, documents. The physical embodiment of royal legitimacy, carried in wagons and carts across a country that no longer wanted its king. On or around the 12th of October 1216, King John made a decision that would haunt historians for centuries. He chose to take his army around the southern edge of the Wash, crossing the tidal estuary at a point called the Welsh Stream, a route that locals knew was crossable, but only under the right conditions. The tide did not cooperate. What happened next depends on which account you trust. The waters rose, suddenly, according to some sources, or perhaps predictably, according to others. The baggage train, moving slower than the troops, was caught mid-crossing. Wagons sank, men drowned, horses panicked and were pulled under by the current. And the treasure, the entire material inheritance of the English monarchy, disappeared into the silt and the salt water of the Wash. King John himself survived. He reached the abbey at Swineshead that night, already gravely ill, and died just 9 days later, leaving behind a kingdom in chaos, a child heir, and a mystery that no one has ever fully resolved. The loss is documented. Multiple medieval chroniclers recorded it, though they disagreed on the scale of what was taken. Some described it as a catastrophic loss of irreplaceable royal regalia. Others suggested the king had already dispersed much of his treasure to various castles for safekeeping, and that what was lost was significant, but not total. Which raises the first of many questions. If the loss was so devastating, why did the royal household recover so quickly? Within years, the English crown was functioning again, ceremonies conducted, symbols of power displayed. Either the loss was overstated, or replacements were made with remarkable speed. Or perhaps not everything went into the water that day. Mainstream historians approach the crossing pragmatically. The Wash is a dangerous, shifting estuary. Tidal surges in the medieval period were poorly understood and difficult to predict. A baggage train moving too slowly across a tidal flat is entirely plausible as a historical accident, one born of desperation and poor judgment rather than conspiracy or drama. The treasure, they suggest, was real. The loss was real, and it is almost certainly still there, buried under centuries of accumulated sediment. The problem is the land itself. The Wash has changed dramatically since 1216. Land reclamation projects over the centuries have pushed the coastline outward. What was once open estuary is now in places dry agricultural field. The Welsh Stream itself no longer exists as a recognizable crossing point. The treasure, if it survived at all, could be buried not beneath water, but beneath farmland, meters down, sealed under layers of peat and clay. Searches have been conducted. Metal detectorists have swept the fields. Archaeological surveys have been commissioned. Nothing of significance has ever been recovered. And yet the search continues because the calculations are staggering. The regalia of the English crown, if even a fraction survived, would represent one of the most significant archaeological finds in British history. Not merely in monetary terms, but in historical and cultural weight. These were objects that had touched the hands of kings, objects that carried the symbolic authority of a nation. Then there are the more speculative corners of this mystery. Some researchers have quietly suggested that the crossing disaster may not have been entirely accidental. King John was a man who trusted very few people, who had spent his reign in a state of near-constant political siege. Is it possible that some portion of the treasure was deliberately hidden before the crossing, placed in the care of loyal agents, buried in locations only the king himself knew, and that his death, just 9 days later, took those locations with him to the grave? There is no evidence for this, but there is also no evidence against it. Others have pointed to the timeline. John's death came so swiftly after the crossing that some contemporaries whispered of poison. A king who dies before he can account for the loss of his own treasury is a king who takes his secrets with him completely, whether by accident, illness, or something darker. The one man who knew the full truth of what was in that baggage train was gone within a fortnight. The wash today looks much as it always has. Gray, flat, indifferent. Birds move across the mud flats. The tide comes and goes with the same mechanical regularity it always has, caring nothing for what it may be covering. Somewhere in that landscape, beneath the water, beneath the fields, beneath 8 centuries of silence, the question remains open. Did the treasure of King John simply sink? Or did some part of it survive, hidden by design or by fate, waiting in the dark for someone who may never come? Some secrets are buried in mud and silt. Others are buried in words. We leave the gray flatlands of eastern England behind and travel now into something less tangible. Not a place you can walk to, not a coastline you can survey with modern equipment. We travel instead into the landscape of medieval imagination, where geography and theology collapsed into one another, and where a single letter sent to the courts of Europe in 1165 AD set off a search that would last for nearly 400 years. The letter arrived without warning. It was addressed to the Byzantine Emperor Manuel I and to Pope Alexander III. It was written, allegedly, by a man who called himself Prester John, a Christian king and priest of immense power, ruling over a vast kingdom somewhere beyond the known world. His realm, he claimed, contained 72 lesser kingdoms. It was home to exotic creatures, fountains of youth, rivers running with gemstones, and a people of extraordinary virtue. And he was, crucially, a Christian, a powerful Christian ruler sitting somewhere behind the Muslim kingdoms that had cut Europe off from the east. To medieval Europe, desperate and embattled, this was not just a letter. It was the possibility of salvation. The document that survives is elaborate, ornate, and deeply strange. Prester John describes his palace as built from crystal and precious stone. He claims his table is made of emerald. He rules over Amazons, dog-headed men, and a tribe of people who live without lying. His kingdom contains the Tower of Babel. He has in his possession a magical mirror that allows him to see everything happening across his entire realm. Read today, it sounds like fantasy, but in 1165 it was treated with the gravity of a diplomatic communique. The letter spread across Europe with remarkable speed. Copies were made in monasteries from England to Bohemia. Popes wrote return letters. Crusader commanders factored this mysterious Eastern ally into their military calculations. Explorers, centuries later, still carried its description in their heads as they moved into uncharted territory. The question that historians have never fully resolved is deceptively simple. Where did it come from? The mainstream scholarly position is that the letter was a forgery, almost certainly composed somewhere in Western Europe, probably by a cleric with theological and political motivations. The language of the letter is Latin. Its imagery draws heavily on existing European texts about the East, recycling descriptions of exotic peoples and wonders that had been circulating since antiquity. The timing, arriving precisely when the Crusader kingdoms were under severe pressure, suggests a document designed to offer hope rather than convey fact. And yet the forgery explanation, satisfying as it is, answers one question while quietly opening several others. If someone forged the letter, they did so with extraordinary care and considerable geographic knowledge. Embedded within the fantastical imagery are details that correspond, loosely but recognizably, to real places and real cultures in Central Asia and East Africa. The description of a kingdom beyond Persia aligns in certain ways with the Mongol territories that European travelers would encounter decades later. The references to a Christian kingdom in Africa correspond to the very real kingdom of Ethiopia, which was indeed Christian, ancient, and largely unknown to medieval Europe at the time. Was the forger drawing on genuine traveler reports that have since been lost? Was there a kernel of real intelligence buried beneath the mythology? The geographical location of Prester John's kingdom shifted over the centuries in a way that is itself deeply revealing. In the original 1165 letter, the kingdom sits somewhere in the east, beyond Persia, perhaps in India or Central Asia. But as European knowledge of those regions grew and no kingdom matching the description was found, the location quietly migrated. By the 14th century, Prester John's realm had moved to Africa, specifically to Ethiopia, a Christian empire with ancient roots stretching back to the time of Solomon. This migration was not random. It followed the edges of European ignorance, always placing the kingdom just beyond what was known, just past the last confirmed map. Ethiopian emperors were themselves sometimes referred to as Prester John in European correspondence, a title applied from the outside, grafted onto a real and sophisticated civilization that had its own entirely separate identity and history. The Ethiopians, for their part, did not use the name. It was a European projection, a myth in search of a host. But here the mystery deepens rather than resolves. Because Ethiopia did exist. Its Christian heritage, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, was genuinely ancient, tracing its roots to the 4th century AD and maintaining traditions that had diverged entirely from Rome. Its emperors claimed descent from Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Its sacred texts included books excluded from the Western Bible. It was, in every meaningful sense, a hidden Christian kingdom. Not mythological, but simply unknown. Did the original Prester John letter encode, however distortedly, genuine rumors of Ethiopia that had filtered along trade routes into European awareness? Could merchant accounts, carried from East Africa through Arabia and into Byzantine trading networks, have seeded the imagination of whoever wrote that letter? There are scholars who believe so. There are others who dismiss the connection entirely. What remains undeniable is the letter's power. It shaped exploration. It shaped diplomacy. It may have influenced the routes that Portuguese navigators chose as they worked their way down the African coast in the 15th century, searching, among other things, for the kingdom of a Christian king. They found Ethiopia. They did not find Prester John. The original letter sits now in the archive of history, studied, debated, never fully explained. We know it moved the world. We do not know with any certainty who wrote it, why, or what grain of truth, if any, it contained. Somewhere between a forger's desk and the edges of the medieval map, the real story began. And it has never quite ended. Some mysteries hide behind words. Others hide in plain sight, standing in the open air, under a wide African sky, waiting for someone to ask the right question. We leave the archival shadows of medieval Europe behind and travel now to the southeastern highlands of Zimbabwe, to a place where the land rises into granite kopjes and the air carries the dry, clean scent of acacia and red earth. It is a landscape of immense quiet, vast, unhurried, ancient in a way that feels physical rather than abstract. And rising from it, without mortar, without explanation, without a single written record of its construction, are the walls of Great Zimbabwe. They are extraordinary up close. The main enclosure, known as the Great Enclosure, runs for over 250 meters in circumference. Its outer wall stands nearly 11 meters high in places and stretches 5 meters thick at its base. It is built from granite blocks, hundreds of thousands of them, cut and shaped and stacked with a precision that produces curves so smooth they appear almost organic, as though the wall grew from the earth rather than being placed upon it. No cement, no mortar, just stone against stone, held in place by weight and geometry and a craftsmanship that has kept the structure standing for centuries. No inscription marks the entrance. No founder's name is carved into the granite. Whoever built this place left no written account of why or how or exactly when. The archaeological consensus places the earliest stone construction at Great Zimbabwe somewhere around the 11th century AD, with the most intensive building occurring between the 12th and 15th centuries. The site is understood to have been the capital of the Kingdom of Zimbabwe, a powerful Schönau state that controlled trade routes between the interior of southern Africa and the coastal ports of the Indian Ocean. Gold, ivory, copper, cloth from Arabia, and porcelain from China. Artifacts from both have been recovered from the site, confirming that Great Zimbabwe was not isolated. It was connected, prosperous, and politically sophisticated. This is the mainstream understanding, and it is well supported by evidence. But the mainstream understanding addresses what Great Zimbabwe became. It is quieter on what it was before. Because the stonework at Great Zimbabwe is not uniform. Archaeologists have identified distinct building phases, distinct styles, distinct levels of technical accomplishment across different parts of the site. The earliest structures, the ones predating the peak of the Kingdom of Zimbabwe, show characteristics that do not map neatly onto what came later. Different techniques, different stone selection, a different relationship between the structures and the landscape around them. Who built those first walls? And were they the same people who built what followed? For much of the colonial period, European scholars refused to accept an indigenous African answer to that question at all. The sophistication of the stonework was deemed, through a lens of profound and deliberate bias, incompatible with African construction. Alternative builders were proposed with a confidence that had no archaeological foundation whatsoever. Phoenicians, Arabs, the legendary inhabitants of King Solomon's mines. The site was mapped onto the Prester John mythology, onto biblical geographies, onto anything that could place the credit elsewhere. This was not archaeology. It was ideology dressed in academic language. The correction came slowly but decisively. By the mid-20th century, and comprehensively by its end, the scholarly consensus had firmly established what indigenous oral tradition had maintained throughout, that Great Zimbabwe was built by the ancestors of the Schönau people. Full stop. But here is where the honest mystery begins, separate entirely from the colonial distortion. Even within the framework of indigenous Schönau construction, the earliest phases of the site resist easy categorization. The radiocarbon dating of the oldest deposits suggests human activity at the location stretching back further than the stone structures themselves, possibly as far back as the 5th or 6th century AD, perhaps earlier. What was happening at this site before the walls went up? What drew people to this specific granite hill, in this specific valley, across such an extended period of time? The placement of the great enclosure is not random. It sits in careful relationship to the hill complex above it, an older structure built into the natural granite boulders of the Kopje, using the rock itself as both material and foundation. The spatial relationship between the two suggests deliberate planning, a vision of the site that preceded the construction of either structure. Someone understood this landscape architecturally before a single block was moved. Some researchers have pointed to astronomical alignments, the positioning of certain entrances and passages in relation to the rising and setting of specific stars. The Zimbabwe bird, a carved soapstone figure found at the site, has been interpreted as both a royal symbol and a navigational or celestial marker. These interpretations remain contested, neither proven nor dismissed. Others have focused on the acoustic properties of the enclosures. Sound behaves unusually within the thick granite walls, carrying in ways that suggest, to some researchers, an intentional design for ceremony or communication. Whether this was a deliberate feature of the construction or an incidental consequence of the geometry is a question that current evidence cannot answer. What we are left with is a site that exceeds, in subtle but persistent ways, the explanations constructed around it. Not because those explanations are wrong, but because the site itself is older, deeper, and more layered than any single narrative fully captures. The walls of Great Zimbabwe have stood through the collapse of kingdoms, through colonial erasure, through decades of academic argument. They have outlasted the people who misrepresented them and the empires that tried to claim them. They are still standing, still silent on the question that matters most. Not who built the Kingdom of Zimbabwe. That answer is known, and it belongs to the Schönau people. But who first looked at this granite hill, in this particular valley, and decided that something here needed to be marked, enclosed, and remembered? That conversation started long before the walls, and we are still not entirely sure where it began. Some mysteries are carved into stone, others are carried in language. We leave the granite highlands of Zimbabwe behind and travel now to something altogether more fluid, a story that exists not in walls or artifacts, but in the mouths of people separated by an ocean, speaking words that should have had no reason to sound alike. It is a story about a Welsh prince, a fleet of ships, and a voyage into the unknown that may, or may not, have happened 3 centuries before Columbus ever left port. And if it did happen, the people who remembered it were not Welsh. The legend of Madog Owain Gwynedd begins in Wales, in the year 1170 AD, in the aftermath of a kingdom fracturing from within. Owain Gwynedd, the powerful ruler of the Welsh kingdom of Gwynedd, had died, leaving behind a succession crisis of brutal proportions. His sons turned on one another. The kingdom bled. And one of those sons, Madog, a prince with seafaring instincts and perhaps the good sense to want no part of what was coming, allegedly looked west across the Atlantic and sailed into it. According to the Welsh tradition, Madog made landfall somewhere in a new world, returned to Wales to gather settlers, and then departed again with a fleet of ships and a company of colonists. He was never heard from again. This is the story, as Wales told it, and for centuries, it was treated as exactly what it sounds like. A romantic legend, a piece of national mythology, the kind of tale that every seafaring culture produces to extend its reach backward into history. Then came the reports from North America, beginning in the late 16th century and continuing with remarkable consistency into the 19th. European explorers, traders, and missionaries returning from the interior of the continent began describing encounters with a Native American people unlike any they had met before. The accounts varied in detail but converged on certain specific points. These people, identified most consistently as the Mandan, a nation living along the upper Missouri River in what is now North Dakota, were described as lighter-skinned than neighboring tribes. Some had blue or gray eyes. Some had hair that Europeans described as ranging from dark to, occasionally, lighter shades. But it was not their appearance that stopped the travelers cold. It was their language. Welsh speakers among the early explorers, and there were several sent deliberately because of the Madog legend, reported hearing words in the Mandan language that bore a startling resemblance to Welsh. Not random phonetic coincidence, but specific words. Words for common objects, for numbers, for actions. The explorer John Evans, a Welshman who traveled to the Mandan villages in 1796 specifically to investigate the legend, spent considerable time among them. His conclusions were carefully worded and have been debated ever since. He did not confirm the legend, but nor did he dismiss it entirely. The Mandan people themselves are one of the most archaeologically distinctive nations of the Great Plains. Unlike the nomadic cultures surrounding them, they were settled, living in permanent, sophisticated villages of large, dome-shaped earth lodges arranged around central plazas. Their agricultural practices were advanced. Their ceremonial life was extraordinarily complex, and their construction techniques, particularly their distinctive bullboats, small, round, hide-covered vessels used for river crossings, were noted by multiple observers to bear an unusual resemblance to the coracles of Wales and the wider Celtic world. This is where the mainstream and the speculative begin their careful negotiation. Historians and linguists who have examined the reported Welsh-Mandan linguistic connections have largely concluded that the similarities were overstated. Products of wishful hearing, confirmation bias, and the tendency of people who desperately want to find something to find it. The Mandan language belongs to the Siouan language family, with no established genetic connection to any Celtic tongue. The physical descriptions of the Mandan people, scholars argue, reflect the natural variation present in any human population, amplified by European observers predisposed to see what the legend had told them to look for. These are serious objections. They deserve to be taken seriously. And yet the coracle comparison lingers. And the consistency of independent reports, spanning 2 centuries, from observers with no obvious coordinating motive, is not nothing. There is another layer to this mystery that rarely receives attention. The Mandan were devastated by a smallpox epidemic in 1837, one of the most catastrophic in the recorded history of the Great Plains. Their population, estimated at several thousand before the outbreak, was reduced to fewer than 150 survivors. An entire cultural memory, oral histories, ceremonial knowledge, linguistic detail, was largely destroyed in a matter of months. Whatever the Mandan knew about their own origins, whatever traditions they carried about their past, most of it died with them in that epidemic. The people who might have clarified or contradicted the Madog legend from their own perspective were gone before the question could be properly asked. That silence is itself a kind of evidence, not of Welsh colonists, but of how completely a culture's self-knowledge can be erased, and how that erasure leaves space for other people's stories to fill the vacuum. The legend of Madog sits now in a peculiar suspended state, not proven, not disproven, resting on a foundation of linguistic coincidence, physical description, technological parallel, and a Welsh tradition that predates the age of exploration by several centuries. Did a Welsh prince sail west in 1170 and find a continent that Europe would not officially discover for another 300 years? Did his colonists survive, integrate, leave traces in language and boat building, and the memory of a people who are now largely gone? The Missouri River still moves north through the plains where the Mandan villages once stood, carrying its water toward the same ocean that Madog allegedly crossed. It has never offered an answer. Some mysteries disappear into rivers, others disappear into war. We leave the wide plains of North America behind and travel now to a world defined by faith, violence, and the extraordinary power that objects. Small, portable, often unremarkable to the eye, could hold over the medieval imagination. We travel to the middle of the 12th century, to a conflict that reshaped the relationship between Christian Europe and the Islamic world, and to a collection of sacred objects that passed through that conflict and came out the other side either lost, hidden, or quietly absorbed into histories that have never been fully told. The Second Crusade launched in 1147 AD with a confidence that its architects would not live to justify. Sparked by the fall of the county of Edessa to the Zengid dynasty, it was the first crusade to be led by European kings, Conrad III of Germany and Louis XVII of France among them. And it arrived in the Holy Land, carrying not just armies, but the full ceremonial and spiritual apparatus of medieval Christian kingship. That apparatus included relics. In the medieval world, relics were not decorative. They were functional. They were carried into battle as protection, displayed before armies as sources of divine favor, and guarded with the same intensity as treasury gold, sometimes more. The fragment of the true cross that the Crusader kingdoms kept at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem was considered the single most powerful object in the Christian world. Smaller relics, bones of saints, pieces of sacred cloth, vials of holy oil, traveled with commanders and kings as personal and military talismans. The Second Crusade brought many such objects east. Some were documented. Most were not. The campaign itself collapsed with a swiftness that shocked Europe. The siege of Damascus in 1148, the Crusade's central military objective, failed within 4 days, one of the most rapid and humiliating military reverses in the history of the Crusades. The Christian forces withdrew in disarray. Kings and commanders returned to Europe chastened, their reputations damaged, and their explanations inadequate. In the chaos of that withdrawal, the accounting of what came back with them was incomplete at best. Mainstream historians approach this straightforwardly. Armies in retreat lose things. Equipment is abandoned. Personal effects are left behind, traded away, or captured. The absence of a comprehensive relic inventory from the Second Crusade reflects the administrative realities of 12th century military campaigning rather than anything more deliberate. This is reasonable, and it likely explains the majority of what went missing. But certain specific absences are harder to account for through chaos alone. Among the objects documented as traveling east with the French royal contingent were several relics of considerable significance, including items from the personal collection of the Abbey of Saint-Denis, the Sacred Heart of French royal identity, which had provided spiritual backing for Louis VII's campaign. The Abbey's records from the period show objects leaving for the Crusade that do not appear in the records of what returned. The gaps are not dramatic. They are quiet, bureaucratic, and easy to overlook. But they are there. The question of what happened to relics captured or lost during the Second Crusade opens into a broader and more complex history of sacred object movement in the 12th century. The Byzantine Empire, through whose territory the Crusader armies passed, had its own relic culture, immensely sophisticated, politically charged, and deeply intertwined with imperial authority. Constantinople at this period was arguably the single greatest repository of Christian relics in the world, having accumulated sacred objects from across the Mediterranean and the Holy Land over centuries of trade and diplomacy and outright acquisition. Some researchers have suggested that relics which disappeared during the Second Crusade did not disappear into disorder. They disappeared into Byzantine custody, that the passage of Western armies through Constantinople created opportunities for exchange, purchase, or appropriation that neither side had strong reasons to document. This is speculative, but it is not implausible. The historical relationship between Western Crusaders and Byzantine emperors was defined by mutual suspicion and strategic deception on both sides. Objects moved between these worlds in ways that official records were often designed to obscure rather than illuminate. Then there is the particular case of the Lance of Antioch. Discovered during the First Crusade in 1098, allegedly the very lance that pierced the side of Christ at the crucifixion, the Holy Lance was one of the most contested relics in the medieval world. Its authenticity was disputed even at the time of its discovery. By the period of the Second Crusade, multiple versions of the lance existed in different locations, each claimed as genuine by different ecclesiastical authorities. The movements of these objects during the turbulence of the 12th century, through campaigns, through the sacking of Constantinople in 1204, through the dispersal of Byzantine treasuries, form a documentary trail that grows increasingly difficult to follow. At least one version of the lance passes out of reliable documentation during this period entirely. Where it went, no source clearly states. The broader pattern is this. The Second Crusade created a moment of maximum movement and minimum documentation for sacred objects of enormous perceived power. Things entered that conflict with the armies and did not emerge with them. Some were destroyed. Some were captured and absorbed into Islamic collections, where they would have been valued as historical curiosities rather than sacred objects. Some may have been hidden deliberately, buried near the walls of Damascus, sealed into the foundations of Crusader fortresses, entrusted to monastic communities whose own records were later lost. And some, perhaps, were taken by individuals acting quietly in the confusion of retreat, carried home by hands that left no record of what they carried. The sacred landscape of the 12th century Holy Land, that narrow strip of territory between the Mediterranean and the desert, in what is today the region of Palestine, was a place where objects accumulated meaning faster than they accumulated documentation. The relics of the Second Crusade did not vanish into myth. They vanished into history, which is sometimes a far harder place to search. And somewhere in that history, in an archive not yet opened or a foundation not yet excavated, some of them may be waiting still. Some things disappear into foundations and archives. Others disappear into the oldest and most reliable hiding place of all, the story told by the winner. We leave the fractured sacred landscape of the medieval Holy Land behind and travel now to a world of dense forest and frozen river, of timber strongholds and dynastic ambition, where power was measured in loyalty, and loyalty was always provisional. We travel to Kievan Rus, the medieval Slavic state that stretched across what is now Ukraine and Russia, in the early years of the 11th century, when a kingdom built on fragile kinship bonds was tearing itself apart from within. And at the center of that tearing, a prince whose name history has never quite been able to say cleanly. Sviatopolk Barmin of Kiev came to power in 1015 AD upon the death of his father, Vladimir the Great, the ruler who had brought Christianity to Kievan Rus. The succession was not smooth. Vladimir had left behind a constellation of sons, each governing a different principality, each with his own army and his own ambitions. In the weeks and months that followed Vladimir's death, several of those sons died. 3 of them, Boris, Gleb, and Sviatoslav, were killed in circumstances that the primary historical source, the Rus Chronicle known as the Primary Chronicle, attributes directly and without hesitation to Sviatopolk. It is from this chronicle that Sviatopolk draws the name history gave him, Sviatopolk the Accursed. But the Primary Chronicle was not written by a neutral observer. It was compiled by monks in Kiev, almost certainly under the patronage of Yaroslav, the brother who eventually defeated Sviatopolk in battle, drove him into exile, and inherited the kingdom. The chronicle that calls Sviatopolk a fratricide was written by the people who served the man who defeated him. This is where the mystery begins. The deaths of Boris and Gleb became the foundation of one of the most significant moments in early Russian Orthodox Christianity. The 2 princes were canonized as saints, the first saints of the Rus Church, celebrated for their refusal to take up arms against their brother, even as assassins approached. Their martyrdom was the spiritual cornerstone of a new Christian identity for Kievan Rus. For that martyrdom to carry its full weight, there had to be a murderer. Sviatopolk was perfectly positioned to fill that role. He was the eldest, he had the most to gain, and he had already demonstrated political ruthlessness by attempting to seize power before his father's death, for which Vladimir had briefly imprisoned him. The logic of his guilt is clean and narrative. Too clean, some historians have quietly noted, for the messy reality of 11th century dynastic politics. Because there was another man with equal motive and greater means. Yaroslav himself, the prince who defeated Sviatopolk, who commissioned or patronized the chronicles that condemned him, who benefited most comprehensively from the deaths of his brothers, has never been seriously implicated in the primary sources. The chronicles he controlled do not raise his name in connection with the killings. They do not need to. Sviatopolk the Accursed absorbs all of it. A minority of historians, working primarily from Scandinavian sources and from inconsistencies within the primary chronicle itself, have raised the possibility that Yaroslav's role in the fratricidal violence of 1015 to 1019 was more active than the official record acknowledges. The Scandinavian sagas, which had less reason to protect Yaroslav's reputation, paint a more ambiguous picture of the period. They do not exonerate Sviatopolk, but they do not present the conflict as the simple story of a monstrous brother and a righteous one. They present it as a war. Sviatopolk's own end is itself deeply strange. Defeated by Yaroslav in battle in 1019, he fled westward and died somewhere in the wilderness between Poland and Bohemia. The primary chronicle records his death with a vividness that feels almost theatrical, describing him as tormented by demons, crying out in terror, unable to rest, dying in agony in a place between 2 lands as a sign of his spiritual damnation. No independent source confirms the details of this death. No grave has ever been identified. No contemporaneous Polish or Bohemian account describes the arrival or death of a fleeing Rus prince in their territory during this period. Sviatopolk simply stops appearing in the record, and the chronicle fills that absence with damnation. This is a technique that medieval historiography employed with some regularity. The death of a villain rendered as divine punishment, the absence of documentation transformed into a narrative of deserved oblivion. It served political and theological purposes simultaneously. It closed the story. but closed stories have a habit of leaving questions at the edges. Was Sviatopolk the architect of his brother's deaths, acting from cold dynastic calculation? Was he a man whose genuine crimes were then amplified and monopolized by a victor's chronicle to serve the canonization of Boris and Gleb and the legitimization of Yaroslav's rule? Or was he something more complicated still? A prince caught in a fratricidal war that all sides were fighting, who simply lost, and whose losing meant that history was written entirely without him. The primary chronicle survives. Yaroslav's legacy survives. He is remembered as Yaroslav the Wise, the great consolidator of Kievan Rus, the builder of St. Sophia Cathedral in Kiev. Sviatopolk survives only as the accursed. Somewhere in the distance between those two legacies, in the gap between a chronicle written by the victors and a reality that no neutral hand recorded, the truth of what happened in Kievan Rus in those violent years of 1015 to 1019 still waits. History named its villain. It did not necessarily find him. Some verdicts are written by chroniclers, others are written by coastlines. We leave the frozen forests of Kievan Rus behind and travel now to the edge of the Baltic Sea, to a chalk cliff rising white and sheer from gray water at the northernmost tip of an island called Rügen, off the coast of what is now northern Germany. The wind here is constant and salt-laden. The sea below is restless, and at the very edge of that cliff, where the land simply stops and the Baltic begins, there once stood a fortress and a temple that served as the last great stronghold of Slavic paganism in northern Europe. It was called Arkona. And in 1168 AD, it fell. What happened to the people inside it has never been fully explained. Arkona was not merely a military fortification. It was a sacred center, the spiritual heart of the Rugan Slavs, a people known as the Rani, who had maintained their pre-Christian religious traditions long after the surrounding regions of northern Europe had been absorbed into the expanding world of medieval Christianity. The temple at the center of the fortress was dedicated to Svantovit, the four-headed god of war, harvest, and divination, a deity of enormous power in the Slavic religious imagination, whose cult extended well beyond Rügen itself and drew pilgrims and tribute from across the Baltic world. The temple was tended by a dedicated priestly class. These were not peripheral figures. They were among the most powerful people in the Rani political structure. Controllers of the temple treasury, interpreters of omens, keepers of a sacred white horse whose movements were used to divine the outcomes of military campaigns. The chief priest of Arkona held authority that in some respects exceeded that of the secular rulers around him. In 1168, the Danish king Valdemar I, operating in alliance with the German bishop Absalon of Roskilde, besieged Arkona. The fortress fell after a relatively brief resistance. The chronicle accounts, primarily those of Saxo Grammaticus, the Danish historian who wrote extensively about the campaign, describe what followed in vivid detail. The great statue of Svantovit was dragged from the temple and destroyed. The temple treasury was seized. The population of Arkona was given a choice familiar to conquered peoples across medieval Europe: convert to Christianity or face the consequences. Most, the sources suggest, converted. But the priests are another matter entirely. Saxo Grammaticus, our most detailed source for the fall of Arkona, describes the destruction of the temple and the humiliation of the cult with considerable satisfaction. He was writing within the Danish Christian tradition that celebrated the conquest as a spiritual victory. His account of what happened to the priestly class is notably vague. They appear in his narrative up to the moment of the fortress's fall, and then they simply recede from the text. No mass execution is recorded. No forced conversion of the priests specifically is documented. No exile, no imprisonment, no account of their dispersal into the surrounding population. They are present, and then they are not. The mainstream historical interpretation treats this absence as an administrative silence. The priests, stripped of their temple and their god, simply became irrelevant to a chronicler focused on military and theological triumph. They likely converted, dispersed, or died in the years following the conquest, their identity as a priestly class dissolving once the institution that defined them was gone. This is a reasonable reading of how religious specialists typically fared in the aftermath of forced conversion in medieval Europe, but it sits uneasily against what we know of this particular priestly class. The priests of Arkona were not simply ritual functionaries. They were the custodians of a substantial treasury, accumulated over generations from the tribute of Rani rulers and the offerings of pilgrims from across the Baltic. Saxo records that Valdemar seized a portion of this treasury, but his accounting of its total contents is imprecise. The temple had been accumulating wealth for a very long time. What Valdemar took may not have been everything that was there. Some researchers have raised the question of whether the priests, aware that the siege was not going in their favor, had time and means to move at least a portion of the temple's sacred objects and treasury before the final fall. The chalk cliffs of Rügen are riddled with caves and natural concealed spaces. The surrounding forests and coastline offered routes that a small group of people who knew the landscape intimately could have used. This is speculation. But it is speculation grounded in a specific and persistent gap in the historical record. There is also the question of what the priests carried in their heads rather than their hands. The religious tradition of Arkona, its rituals, its mythologies, its understanding of Sviatopolk and the broader Slavic sacred world, was an oral tradition. It was not written down. It existed in the memory and practice of the people who maintained it. When those people disappeared from the record, the tradition they carried disappeared with them. Or did it? Folklorists working in the Baltic and Slavic regions in the 19th and early 20th centuries documented persistent local traditions in the areas surrounding Rügen, stories, seasonal practices, and beliefs about sacred landscapes that bore traces of pre-Christian religious structures. Whether these represented genuine survivals of the Arkona tradition, carried underground through 8 centuries of Christian dominance, or simply the normal persistence of folk belief that resists formal religious replacement, is a question that scholarship has not definitively resolved. The cliff at Arkona still stands. The Baltic still moves beneath it, gray and indifferent, eroding the chalk face year by year. The fortress is long gone, taken not by conquest, but by the slow patience of the sea. The priests who tended Sviatopolk's temple walked out of recorded history in 1168 and did not walk back in. Where they went, what they carried, and whether anything of what they knew survived the silence that followed. That question belongs to the wind off the Baltic, and the wind has never answered. Some secrets disappear into wind and water. Others are sealed beneath stone. We leave the eroding cliffs of the Baltic behind and travel now to one of the most contested and scrutinized pieces of ground on the surface of the earth, a flat-topped limestone plateau rising above the ancient city of Jerusalem, in the heart of what is today the region of Palestine. It has been built upon, destroyed, rebuilt, fought over, and prayed toward by 3 of the world's major religions for 3,000 years. Every stone on its surface carries a layer of history, and beneath its surface, cut into the bedrock by hands separated by centuries and belief systems, lies a network of tunnels, cisterns, and chambers that has never been fully mapped. What was found inside those spaces, or what was hidden there, during the period of Crusader rule, is a question that has never been cleanly answered. The Temple Mount, known in Arabic as Haram al-Sharif, sits at the gravitational center of Jerusalem's sacred geography. To Jewish tradition, it is the site of the first and second temples, the holiest ground in the world. To Islam, it is the location from which the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven, marked by the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. When the Crusaders took Jerusalem in 1099 AD, they took it all: the city, the plateau, the mosques, and whatever lay beneath. The Crusaders converted the Al-Aqsa Mosque into a palace, and later, a headquarters. They called it the Templum Salomonis, the Temple of Solomon, and it was here, around 1119 AD, that a small group of knights established themselves in the vaulted spaces beneath the southern end of the mount, in a warren of ancient underground rooms that had served, at various points in their long history, as stables, storage facilities, and possibly something else entirely. These knights called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. History knows them as the Knights Templar. The Templars occupied the spaces beneath the Temple Mount for nearly a century. They built, they excavated, and they operated in an environment of extraordinary historical density. Directly above, and in some cases directly within, structures whose origins stretched back through Islamic, Byzantine, Roman, Herodian, and earlier layers of construction. What they encountered in those underground spaces, what they removed, and what they may have been looking for, has generated more speculation than perhaps any single archaeological question in the medieval period. The mainstream historical position is measured. The Templars were a military and religious order with practical needs. They required stabling for horses, storage for equipment, and secure spaces for an organization that was simultaneously a fighting force, a banking institution, and a religious brotherhood. The underground spaces beneath Al-Aqsa were convenient, available, and already partially developed. Their occupation of those spaces reflects logistics rather than treasure hunting. This is sensible, and it likely accounts for the majority of what the Templars were doing beneath the mount. But the excavations themselves are a matter of record. In 1867, a British military engineer named Charles Warren conducted the first systematic archaeological survey of the underground structures beneath the Temple Mount. Working with extraordinary difficulty, the Ottoman authorities permitted limited and closely supervised access. Warren mapped a network of tunnels, cisterns, and passages of considerable complexity. In one area, his team discovered a tunnel that appeared to lead directly toward the foundations of the Dome of the Rock. Within that tunnel, they found several objects that they attributed to Crusader origin: a spur, a lance tip, a small wooden board with a Templar cross. The objects were unremarkable individually. Their location was not. Someone during the Crusader period had been moving through the bedrock beneath the most sacred point on the Temple Mount. The question of what the Templars were seeking, if they were seeking anything at all, opens into the deepest and most contested layer of this mystery. Medieval and later tradition associates the Temple Mount with the Ark of the Covenant, with the treasures of the First and Second Temples, and with documents of foundational religious significance. The destruction of the Second Temple by Rome in 70 AD left the fate of the temple treasury unresolved in the historical record. The Arch of Titus in Rome depicts sacred objects, the menorah, the table of showbread, being carried into Roman captivity. But not everything is accounted for in that frieze. Whether anything of the temple period survived beneath the mount, sealed into the bedrock during the chaos of Roman siege and destruction, is a question that archaeology has not been permitted to properly investigate. The Temple Mount today is administered by the Islamic Waqf Authority, and full archaeological excavation of the site is politically and religiously impossible. A reflection not of obstruction, but of the extraordinary sensitivity of ground that three faiths regard as sacred. What lies beneath the surface in the unexcavated sections remains genuinely unknown. Some researchers, working from Templar documents, from Warren's survey notes, and from the accounts of medieval pilgrims who described underground spaces of surprising extent, have proposed that the Templars did find something beneath the mount during their century of occupation. The rapid rise of the Templar Order, from 9 impoverished knights to the most powerful military financial institution in Christendom within a single generation, has struck some historians as disproportionate to their stated activities, suggesting an acquisition of leverage or knowledge that the official record does not capture. This is speculative territory. The Templars were also simply very good at what they did, arriving at the right moment in the right place, with the right combination of skills. But the tunnel that Warren found, pointing toward the Dome of the Rock, containing Crusader artifacts, cut into bedrock that no official record describes being cut, has not been fully explained. Beneath the Temple Mount in Palestine, in the silence below one of the most contested and sacred sites on earth, the bedrock keeps its own counsel. Whatever was there before the Crusaders arrived, whatever the Crusaders found or did not find, whatever remains sealed in the unexcavated chambers that Warren's survey could not reach, the stone has been patient for a very long time, and no one has yet asked it the right question. Some secrets are sealed in bedrock. Others are sealed in silence. the deliberate, administrative silence of a civilization that burned what it could not control. We rise from the limestone depths beneath Jerusalem and travel now westward across the Mediterranean, following the arc of a world that was, in the 12th and 13th centuries, far more intellectually interconnected than its wars suggested. We travel to North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula, to the vast territory governed by the Almohad Caliphate, a Berber Muslim dynasty that rose from the Atlas Mountains of Morocco and stretched at its peak from the Sahara to the Tagus River in what is now Portugal and Spain. The Almohads are remembered in Western history primarily as conquerors, the dynasty that ended the relative cultural openness of Andalusian Islam and drove figures like the philosopher Maimonides and the physician Ibn Rushd, known in Europe as Averroes, into exile or silence. That memory is accurate as far as it goes, but it does not go far enough, because before the Almohads became enforcers of theological orthodoxy, they were, for a brief and complicated period, collectors. And what they collected, in the libraries of Marrakesh, of Seville, of Cordoba, and Fez, represented one of the most significant accumulations of human knowledge in the medieval world. The library at Marrakesh, the Almohad capital, is the one that concerns us most. It grew through conquest and confiscation, absorbing the collections of the dynasties the Almohads displaced. The Almoravids, the Taifa kingdoms of Al-Andalus, the accumulated scholarly inheritance of 3 centuries of Andalusian intellectual culture. Books on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and theology. Translations of Greek texts that had passed through Arabic and accumulated generations of commentary. Original works by scholars whose names the West would not encounter for another century, if at all. The library also contained something more sensitive, works that the Almohad theological establishment regarded with deep ambivalence. Books that pushed at the edges of Islamic orthodoxy. Philosophical texts that engaged with Greek rationalism in ways that strict Almohad doctrine found dangerous. The works of scholars who had flourished under more permissive predecessors and whose ideas the Almohads simultaneously inherited and suppressed. This tension between the Almohads as preservers and the Almohads as censors defines the central mystery of what happened to the library. The historical record documents a series of book burnings under Almohad authority. The most significant occurred under the Caliph Abu Yusuf Yaqub al-Mansur in the late 12th century, directed specifically at philosophical texts, the works of Aristotle and their Arabic commentaries, books of logic, texts that al-Mansur deemed incompatible with correct belief. Ibn Rushd, the greatest Aristotelian commentator of the age, was exiled, and his books were burned at al-Mansur's order. This is documented. It happened. But book burnings in the medieval world were rarely total. They were performances as much as destructions, demonstrations of orthodox authority that satisfied theological requirements without necessarily eliminating every copy of the condemned texts. Libraries were large, catalogs were incomplete, and loyal officials with access to collections were sometimes quietly reluctant to carry orders to their fullest conclusion. Mainstream historians point to the survival of Ibn Rushd's works in Hebrew and Latin translation as evidence that the Almohad burnings, devastating as they were, did not erase the philosophical tradition they targeted. The works survived, through Jewish scholars who translated them in Al-Andalus, through Christian translators working in Toledo, through the networks of intellectual transmission that crossed religious boundaries throughout the medieval Mediterranean. But the originals, the Arabic manuscripts in the Almohad collections, are another question. The Almohad Caliphate collapsed in the 13th century, fragmenting under pressure from the Christian Reconquista in the north and internal dynastic conflict. Marrakesh fell to the Marinid dynasty in 1269. In the transitions of power that followed, the fate of the Caliphal library is poorly documented. Some volumes were certainly absorbed into Marinid collections. Some were dispersed among private owners. Some were almost certainly destroyed, not by ideological decree this time, but by the ordinary entropy of political collapse. But some researchers have pointed to a more deliberate possibility. The Almohad court, in the years before its final collapse, was not without warning. The dynasty had time to observe its own decline, and within the administrative structure of a sophisticated Islamic caliphate, the disposition of a royal library in times of crisis was not an afterthought. It was a matter of state. Collections were moved, divided, entrusted to institutions or individuals capable of preserving them. Several medieval Arabic sources make passing reference to books from the Almohad collections appearing in unexpected locations. In the libraries of Moroccan madrasas, in private collections in Fez and Tlemcen, in the holdings of Sufi brotherhoods operating in the Maghreb. These references are fragmentary and have not been systematically pursued. The libraries of the Maghreb remain, even today, incompletely catalogued. Manuscript collections in Fez, in Timbuktu, in the Zawiya libraries of the Moroccan interior contain volumes whose full contents have never been published or cross-referenced against the known losses of the Almohad period. The Ahmed Baba Institute in Timbuktu alone holds hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, a significant portion of which remain unexamined by Western scholarship. The question is not whether Almohad manuscripts survived. Some clearly did. Fragments surface periodically in auction catalogs and private sales, traced through chains of custody that disappear into the 13th century. The question is whether the core of the Caliphal library, the most significant and most sensitive texts, the ones that the Almohad establishment both valued and feared, was preserved in a form and a location that the historical record has not yet identified. Somewhere in the libraries of North Africa, in the manuscript rooms of institutions that scholarship has not fully entered, in the collections of families whose inheritance stretches back 8 centuries. The books may still be there, waiting, as books do, with the particular patience of things that contain more than their keepers understood. Some things wait in libraries, patient and unread. Others wait in a different kind of record entirely. Not written by scholars or administrators, but dictated in states of altered consciousness by people who believed, with complete sincerity, that what they were seeing was real. We leave the manuscript rooms of North Africa behind and travel now to the green forested hills of the Rhineland in 12th century Germany, to a Benedictine double monastery sitting quietly above the Lahn River in a village called Schönau, not far from the city of Trier. It is a modest place by the standards of the great medieval abbeys. Stone walls, candlelight, the rhythm of liturgical hours dividing the day into prayer and silence, and prayer again. Inside that silence, beginning around 1152 AD, a young nun named Elisabeth began to see things. What she saw, and more importantly, what she and her brother Ecbert did with what she saw, would circulate across Europe within her lifetime, influence the development of medieval Christian mysticism, generate a controversy that has never been fully resolved, and leave behind a documentary record that modern scholars continue to approach with a combination of fascination and deep unease. Elisabeth of Schönau was not the first Christian mystic, and she would not be the last. The 12th century was a period of intense visionary activity within European monasticism. Hildegard of Bingen, Elisabeth's contemporary and correspondent, was producing her own extraordinary visions at Rupertsberg, not far away. The age was, in some sense, ready for this kind of spiritual witness. But what made Elisabeth unusual, what separates her case from the broader tradition of medieval mysticism and pushes it into genuinely strange territory, was not the visions themselves. It was what the visions claimed to verify. In 1156, a large collection of bones was discovered in Cologne. The bones were identified by local church authorities as the remains of Saint Ursula and her companions, the legendary British princess and her 11,000 virgin martyrs, allegedly killed by Huns near Cologne in the 4th or 5th century. The discovery was announced with considerable ecclesiastical enthusiasm. Cologne had long claimed Ursula as its patron saint, and the physical confirmation of her martyrs' remains was treated as a moment of profound spiritual significance. There was, however, a problem. 11,000 martyrs produce an extraordinary quantity of bones, and among the bones recovered at Cologne were skeletons that did not belong to young women, skeletons of men, of children, of individuals whose age and sex contradicted the legend entirely. Questions were being raised. carefully and quietly, about whether the Cologne bones were what the church authorities claimed them to be. It was at this point that Elisabeth of Schönau's visions became directly relevant. Over a period of years, Elisabeth received a series of visions specifically concerning the Ursula martyrs. In these visions, individual skulls and bones from the Cologne collection spoke to her, identifying themselves by name, confirming their martyrdom, providing biographical details about their lives and deaths. The visions were recorded by her brother Egbert, a monk of considerable education and literary sophistication, and circulated as the revelations of Saint Elisabeth. The effect was significant. In a period before modern forensic analysis, before any systematic framework for evaluating such claims, Elisabeth's visions served as a form of spiritual authentication for the Cologne bones. Doubts were not eliminated, but they were complicated. Here was a mystic of recognized holiness, receiving direct communication from the martyrs themselves. To dismiss the bones was, in some sense, to dismiss her testimony. The mainstream scholarly interpretation of this situation is careful but fairly clear. Elisabeth was almost certainly a sincere visionary, a woman of genuine spiritual intensity who experienced states of consciousness that, whatever their ultimate source, were real and often physically debilitating for her. The visions concerning the Ursula bones, however, bear the clear editorial mark of Egbert, who shaped and recorded them. Whether Elisabeth's visions were being unconsciously influenced by Egbert's own theological agenda, or whether Egbert was actively constructing a narrative around his sister's genuine experiences, is a question that the surviving texts cannot definitively resolve. What is clear is that the Cologne bones were almost certainly not what they were claimed to be. Modern analysis has confirmed what medieval skeptics suspected. The collection contained remains from multiple periods and populations, including individuals who could not have been early Christian martyrs by any chronological measure. The legend of 11,000 virgins almost certainly arose from a misreading of an early inscription. The Latin numeral for 11, combined with a name abbreviation, generating a number that was never meant to be taken literally. Elisabeth's visions authenticated something that was not authentic. But here, the mystery deepens, rather than closes. Because Elisabeth's visions were not limited to the Ursula martyrs. Her broader visionary record, the Liber Visionum, the Book of Visions, compiled over more than a decade, describes experiences of extraordinary vividness and doctrinal complexity. She describes heavenly landscapes, encounters with angels and saints, dialogues with the Virgin Mary on points of theology. She describes her own physical suffering during the visions, convulsions, paralysis, periods of insensibility that lasted hours and left her physically depleted. These physical manifestations were witnessed and recorded by members of her community. They were not private or unverifiable in the way that purely interior spiritual experiences tend to be. Something was happening to Elisabeth of Schönau. The question of what, exactly, remains genuinely open. Modern researchers approaching the Liber Visionum have identified within it layers of authentic visionary experience, editorial shaping by Egbert, conscious theological construction, and, in certain passages, descriptions of psychological and physical states that correspond to what contemporary medicine would recognize as complex neurological or dissociative episodes. These frameworks are not mutually exclusive. A woman experiencing genuine neurological events might also be a sincere mystic, might also be shaped by an educated brother with his own agenda, might also be responding to the intense pressures and expectations of a religious community that was watching her and recording everything she did. The Liber Visionum is all of these things simultaneously, which is precisely what makes it so difficult to read cleanly. What troubles historians most is not the visions themselves, but their consequences. Bones across Europe were authenticated by Elisabeth's testimony. Cults were established. Pilgrimage routes were organized. The spiritual economy of the medieval church was shaped in small but real ways by what a woman in a monastery in the Rhineland said she saw while she was somewhere else entirely. Whatever Elisabeth of Schönau was experiencing in those states of altered consciousness, the world took it seriously. It built churches around it. It moved bones because of it. And the question that no framework, medical, theological, or historical, has yet fully answered is the one that Elisabeth herself never seems to have doubted. What was she actually seeing? Some questions are asked in candlelit rooms. Others are asked by the wind moving across an empty steppe, where cities once stood and the ground has long since swallowed their foundations. We leave the Rhineland behind, its monasteries, its visions, its careful records of things seen and unseen, and travel now in a direction that medieval Europe barely understood existed. Eastward. Far eastward. Past the edges of the known world as the 12th century mapped it, past the territories where Crusaders fought and Almohad Caliphs collected books, past even the furthest reach of the Silk Road as most Western merchants knew it, into the vast interior of Central Asia, into a landscape of such scale and such silence that the civilizations it once contained have been almost entirely erased from Western historical memory. Here, in the region stretching across what is now Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and the western edges of China's Xinjiang province, there existed between 1124 and 1218 AD a state of extraordinary complexity and historical significance. It was called the Qara Khitai, and almost no one in the Western world has heard of it. The Qara Khitai, the name translates roughly as Black Cathay, was founded by a Khitan prince named Yelu Dashi, who led the remnants of the Liao dynasty westward after their defeat by the Jurchen Jin dynasty in northern China. What Yelu Dashi built in Central Asia was something genuinely unusual in the medieval world. A multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire governed by a ruling class of Chinese-educated Khitan aristocrats presiding over a population that included Turkic Muslims, Nestorian Christians, Buddhists, and shamanists, all coexisting within a single administrative framework that demanded political loyalty without requiring religious conformity. This was not tolerance in the modern sense. It was pragmatic statecraft of a sophisticated kind, and it produced for nearly a century a stability across the Central Asian steppe that allowed cities to grow, trade routes to function, and a frontier urban culture to develop along the empire's edges. Cities that have since vanished so completely that their precise locations are still, in some cases, matters of active archaeological debate. The frontier cities of the Qara Khitai were not minor settlements. They were functioning urban centers, administrative nodes, trading posts, and military garrisons, positioned along the empire's contested borders with the Khwarezmian Empire to the west and the various Turkic powers pressing from the north and east. They had walls, markets, and administrative buildings. They had populations large enough to require organized water management in an environment where water was never abundant. And then, in 1218, the Mongols came. Genghis Khan's absorption of the Qara Khitai was swift and total. The last Qara Khitai ruler, Kuchlug, himself a Naiman usurper who had seized the throne from the legitimate Gurkhan lineage, was hunted down and killed. The administrative structure of the empire was dismantled. Its ruling class was absorbed, displaced, or destroyed. The Mongol expansion that followed reshaped Central Asia so completely that the physical landscape of the pre-Mongol world was, in many areas, simply overwritten. The frontier cities did not all survive that overwriting. Mainstream archaeology approaches the question of the Qara Khitai urban centers carefully because the evidence is genuinely difficult to work with. The cities that have been identified and partially excavated, sites in the Chu River Valley, in the Talas region, in the Fergana Basin, show occupation layers consistent with the Qara Khitai period, but the destruction and rebuilding cycles of the subsequent Mongol and Timurid periods have complicated the stratigraphic picture considerably. What was Qara Khitai, what was earlier, and what was later is not always possible to distinguish without extensive and expensive excavation. The region is also, in the bluntest terms, under-excavated. Central Asian archaeology has historically operated with a fraction of the resources directed toward more accessible and politically prominent sites in the Middle East, Europe, and East Asia. Large areas of the Qara Khitai frontier zone have received only surface survey, if that. Satellite imagery analysis conducted in recent decades has identified anomalies in the landscape. geometric earthworks, buried wall lines, the faint rectangular shadows of foundations that correspond to the expected locations of urban centers mentioned in medieval Chinese and Persian sources. Some of these anomalies have not yet been investigated on the ground. The Persian and Chinese documentary sources that describe the Khitai frontier cities are themselves a puzzle. Medieval Persian geographers writing within a generation of the empire's fall describe cities by name, Kayalik, Al-Malik, Balasagun, and provide details of their size, their trade, their populations. Some of these cities have been tentatively identified with known archaeological sites. Others remain unlocated, their names floating in the documentary record without a confirmed physical correspondent. Balasagun is perhaps the most tantalizing case, known from multiple independent sources as a significant city, possibly the Khitai western capital, certainly a place of considerable importance in the Trans-Eurasian trade network. Its precise location has been debated for over a century. A site at Barana in modern Kyrgyzstan, marked by a single surviving minaret rising incongruously from the flat valley floor, is the leading candidate. Excavations there have confirmed substantial medieval occupation. But whether the Barana site fully accounts for what the sources describe as Balasagun, or whether the city extended further than current excavations have revealed, remains an open question. There is also the matter of what the Khitai court carried with it when Yeludashi led his people west from China. The Khitan ruling class were the inheritors of the Liao dynasty's sophisticated cultural tradition, a tradition that had absorbed and adapted Tang Chinese administrative and artistic practices over 2 centuries. They brought with them literacy, bureaucratic expertise, and almost certainly a material culture of considerable richness. None of that material culture has been recovered in quantity. The Khitai produced no known monumental art comparable to what their Liao predecessors left in northern China. Either it was destroyed, or it has not yet been found. Or, as some researchers have quietly suggested, the nomadic administrative habits of the steppe meant that the most significant objects of the Khitai court remained mobile, traveling with the ruling household rather than being deposited in fixed urban locations. Mobile treasuries are the hardest kind to find. The steppe of Central Asia is vast beyond easy comprehension. It absorbs civilizations the way the sea absorbs ships, completely and without visible trace. The Khitai governed a territory larger than Western Europe for nearly a century, built cities along its frontiers, administered a multi-ethnic population with documented sophistication, and then vanished into the Mongol storm so thoroughly that their name is almost entirely absent from the popular historical imagination. Somewhere beneath the grass and the accumulated sediment of 8 centuries, the foundations of their frontier cities still lie in the dark, waiting for someone to ask where they are. Some mysteries lie buried beneath grass and sediment, waiting for the right excavation. Others lie in plain sight, printed in scholarly editions, held in climate-controlled archive drawers, read and cited and debated for centuries, and remain, despite all of that attention, fundamentally unresolved. We return now from the vast silences of the Central Asian steppe and travel back toward the Mediterranean world, back to the narrow, contested geography of Palestine, to the Crusader states that clung to the eastern coastline and the highland passes of the Levant throughout the 12th and 13th centuries. It is a world we have touched before in this exploration, but we approach it now from a different angle entirely. Not through its battles or its relics or its underground chambers. Through its words, because someone was watching the Crusades very carefully. Someone with access to the inner councils of the Crusader kingdoms, with knowledge of diplomatic correspondence that was never meant to be public, with a command of Latin prose that places them among the finest writers of the medieval period. Someone who recorded events with a precision and an insider's intimacy that has puzzled historians for generations, and that someone never told us who they were. The chronicle tradition of the Crusader states is rich and complex. Named authors, William of Tyre, Fulcher of Chartres, Raymond of Aguilers, left substantial works that form the backbone of our understanding of the period. These men are known quantities. Their backgrounds are documented, their biases understood, their positions within the Crusader political and ecclesiastical hierarchy traceable. But running alongside the name tradition is a body of work. Several chronicles and documentary compilations from the 12th and early 13th centuries, whose authorship is attributed in the manuscripts themselves, either anonymously or to names that scholarship has been unable to verify as real individuals. These texts are not peripheral curiosities. They contain information found nowhere else. They describe events from perspectives that imply direct participation or extraordinary access. And they display, across their different surviving forms, a set of stylistic and intellectual consistencies that have led a minority of scholars to propose something remarkable: that several of these anonymous texts may share a single author. The proposal is not new. It has surfaced periodically in the specialist literature on Crusader historiography since the 19th century, advanced carefully, disputed carefully, and never resolved. The problem is partly one of evidence and partly one of methodology. Attributing anonymous medieval texts to a single author requires demonstrating consistent patterns of vocabulary, syntax, source usage, and intellectual preoccupation across works that may survive in multiple manuscript traditions, each with its own copying errors and editorial interventions. It is painstaking work, and the conclusions it generates are always provisional. What the scholars who have pursued this question most persistently have identified is a cluster of characteristics that appear across several anonymous Crusader texts with a frequency that seems to exceed coincidence. A particular way of handling diplomatic language, rendering the substance of letters and negotiations with a precision that suggests either direct access to the documents or personal presence at the negotiations themselves. A consistent interest in the internal politics of the Crusader nobility that goes beyond what an outside observer could have known. A recurring set of classical references, specific authors, specific passages that suggests a library and an education of a particular kind. And a point of view. Subtle, carefully managed, but detectable across the texts. A perspective that is sympathetic to the Crusader project without being uncritical of it. That notices the failures of Crusader leadership with a clarity that implies proximity. That records the perspectives of Muslim opponents with an accuracy and occasional respect that was unusual for the period and suggests either direct contact or access to Arabic sources. Who had all of these qualities simultaneously in the 12th century Crusader states? The candidates that various scholars have proposed over the years cover a significant range. A senior cleric with diplomatic responsibilities, someone whose role required both Latin learning and direct engagement with the political negotiations of the Crusader kingdoms. A member of one of the military orders, possibly the Templars or Hospitallers, whose institutional position gave them access to the innermost councils of Crusader strategy. A secular administrator, a chancellor or notary, whose professional function was the management of exactly the kind of documentary record that the anonymous texts seem to draw upon. Each of these proposals fits some of the evidence and struggles with other parts of it. There is also a more unsettling possibility that a small number of researchers have raised with appropriate caution. The anonymous author, if there is indeed a single author behind multiple texts, may have been deliberately concealing their identity, not through carelessness or the ordinary anonymity of medieval scribal culture, but by choice. The texts contain material that, if attributed to a known individual, would have been politically dangerous. Criticisms of specific Crusader leaders, accounts of military failures that the official record preferred to minimize. Diplomatic details that certain parties would have preferred remained confidential. An author with that kind of knowledge, writing that kind of material, had reasons to be careful. The manuscript tradition itself offers tantalizing and frustrating clues. Several of the texts in question survive in copies made not in Palestine but in Western Europe, in French and Italian monasteries and cathedral libraries, suggesting that the original documents or copies of them traveled west at some point. The channels through which they traveled are not always traceable. They appear in library catalogs without explanation of provenance, acquired from sources that the catalogers either did not know or did not record. One manuscript, held in a European archive and examined in detail by a specialist in Crusader documentary history in the late 20th century, contains marginal annotations in a hand distinct from the main text. Annotations that appear to correct or supplement the narrative in ways that imply the annotator had independent knowledge of the events described. The annotator is no more identified than the author. One correction points to a date, another to a name, a third to the location of a negotiation, each small, each precise, each suggesting someone who was there. The main text and the marginal corrections may be by the same hand, or they may represent two separate individuals, both anonymous, both intimately familiar with the events of the Crusader period. The Chronicles sit in their archives, available to any scholar with the right permissions and the patience for medieval Latin. They have been read many times. They have been cited, translated in parts, analyzed for their content. But the person behind them, educated, well-positioned, politically aware, and deliberately silent about their own identity, has never been found. In the margins of the Crusader historical record, in the gap between what was written and who wrote it, a voice speaks with quiet precision about events in the hills and ports and negotiating chambers of medieval Palestine. It has never introduced itself, and it has never been made to. Some voices speak from the margins of chronicles without ever giving their names. Others speak from the edges of maps, from the furthest points of known geography, and then fall silent before they can tell us what they found. We leave the Mediterranean world behind, with its chronicles and its carefully managed silences, and travel now in a direction that feels almost counterintuitive. Not west, not into the familiar terrain of European or Islamic history, but east, far east, to an archipelago of islands rising from the Pacific in a long curved chain, where a civilization of extraordinary refinement was, in the late 10th and 11th centuries, producing some of the most sophisticated literature in the medieval world while simultaneously turning its back, deliberately, institutionally, almost philosophically, on the ocean that surrounded it on every side. Japan in the late Heian period, roughly 794 to 1185 AD, was a culture in a state of carefully maintained introversion. The great embassies to Tang China, which had driven Japanese cultural and administrative development for centuries, had been officially suspended in 894 AD. The decision was pragmatic. The Tang dynasty was collapsing, the sea crossings were dangerous, and the Heian court had absorbed enough of Chinese culture to feel, perhaps, that the relationship had served its purpose. But the ocean did not stop moving simply because the court stopped looking at it. Along the coastlines of northern Honshu and Hokkaido, in the ports and fishing communities that existed at considerable remove from the aesthetic preoccupations of the Heian aristocracy in Kyoto, maritime activity continued. Japanese and Ainu fishermen worked waters that extended further than the official cartography acknowledged. Traders moved along coastal routes that connected Japan to the Korean peninsula, and through it to the Asian mainland. And occasionally, rarely but documentably, vessels from Japan's northern waters encountered things, and people, and coastlines that the court record does not adequately explain. The mystery begins in the gaps of the official sources. The Heian period is extraordinarily well documented in certain registers. Court diaries, literary works, poetry anthologies, religious records. The inner life of the Heian aristocracy is preserved in remarkable detail. What is not well documented is the maritime periphery, the activities of the northern coastal communities, the movements of vessels beyond the established trade routes, the encounters that fishermen and traders had with the peoples of Sakhalin, the Kuril Islands, and the coastlines beyond. These exist in the historical record only as fragments. A passing reference in a provincial document, a notation in a Buddhist temple record, a gift of unfamiliar goods recorded in a court inventory without explanation of their origin. Several of these fragments examined together suggest something that the mainstream record does not explicitly state, that Japanese vessels in the late Heian period were reaching destinations further north and east than the official geographic understanding of the period should have permitted, and that accounts of what they found there, if such accounts were ever written, have not survived. The mainstream historical position on Heian maritime activity is cautious. Japan was not, in this period, a significant naval power. The Heian court's withdrawal from formal diplomatic engagement with China was accompanied by a broader cultural devaluation of the maritime sphere. Seafaring was the province of commoners and traders, not of the literate class that produced and preserved documents. The absence of expedition accounts, scholars argue, reflects the absence of expeditions worthy of the name. Informal coastal trading does not generate formal records. This is reasonable, and it likely accounts for much of the silence. But there are specific anomalies that the general explanation does not fully absorb. Among the most discussed is a set of references in the Shoku Nihon Koki and related administrative documents to goods arriving in northern Japanese ports from sources described in terms that do not correspond to any known trading partner of the period. Furs of unfamiliar type, carved objects and materials not native to the Japanese archipelago. On at least 2 occasions, references to people, brought back or arriving independently, whose physical description and language place them outside the known categories of Ainu, Korean, or Chinese. Who these people were and where they came from, the documents do not say clearly. The notations are brief, incidental, recorded by administrators whose interest was in the goods rather than the geography. But the goods had to come from somewhere. Some researchers have pointed toward the possibility of contact with the indigenous peoples of the Kamchatka Peninsula or the Aleutian Chain, maritime cultures who themselves operated across enormous distances of open Pacific water, and whose trade networks extended in ways that 19th and 20th century archaeology has only partially mapped. If Japanese vessels were reaching Sakhalin regularly, and if Sakhalin traders were connected to networks extending further north and east, then the anomalous goods in the Heian port records might represent the tail end of a much longer chain of exchange. This is speculative. The archaeological evidence for direct Japanese contact with Kamchatkan or Aleutian cultures in the Heian period does not currently exist in confirmed form. But the question of what happened to any accounts that might have been made is itself worth dwelling on. The transition from the Heian to the Kamakura period in the late 12th century was not a gentle administrative handover. It was a fundamental reorganization of Japanese society. A shift of effective power from the court aristocracy to the warrior class that was accompanied by considerable institutional disruption. Temple and court archives were damaged or destroyed. Documentary collections that had been maintained by aristocratic families were dispersed as those families lost influence and resources. The physical record of the late Heian period is substantially incomplete, not because records were never made, but because the conditions for their preservation did not hold. What was peripheral to begin with, maritime accounts from northern ports, records of encounters with unfamiliar peoples, the navigational knowledge of fishermen who left no literary legacy, was the first to disappear. There is also the question of what was never written at all. The people who knew the northern waters best in the late Heian period, the Ainu communities of Hokkaido and Sakhalin, the coastal traders of the northern ports, operated within oral traditions. Their knowledge of the sea, of the routes and the peoples and the distances, was carried in memory and transmitted in speech. It was not committed to paper that could survive. That knowledge is gone, or it is buried so deeply within later ethnographic records and folk traditions that its Heian period core is no longer distinguishable. Somewhere in the northern Pacific, in the waters that Japanese vessels were quietly working during the centuries that the Heian court was writing poetry and managing its aesthetic refinements, encounters happened that left almost no trace. The sea that surrounds Japan has been carrying its own account of those years. It has simply never been transcribed. Some knowledge disappears into untranscribed ocean. Other knowledge disappears into legend, which is its own kind of deep water, difficult to navigate and easy to drown in. We leave the northern Pacific behind and travel now to the Iberian Peninsula, to the sun-hardened plains and fortified hilltop cities of medieval Spain, to a world where Christian and Muslim kingdoms contested the same geography for centuries, in a conflict so prolonged and so intimate that it produced, in its friction, some of the most complex and fascinating figures in medieval European history. One of those figures carried a sword. His name was Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar. History knows him as El Cid, a title derived from the Arabic word Sayyid, meaning Lord, given to him by the Moorish soldiers who served under him, which tells you something important about the man before a single fact of his biography is stated. He was a Castilian knight who fought for Christian kings and Muslim rulers with an allegiance that was less theological than professional, less ideological than pragmatic. He captured the city of Valencia from its Muslim rulers in 1094 and governed it until his death in 1099, the same year the First Crusade took Jerusalem, on the other end of the Mediterranean world. He was, in his own lifetime, already a legend. And the sword he carried, called Tizona, according to the tradition that crystallized around him in the decades and centuries after his death, became something more than a weapon. It became an object of symbolic weight so considerable that kings wanted to own it. Dynasties claimed it as legitimizing inheritance, and its movements through Spanish history over the following 9 centuries generated a documentary trail that is simultaneously detailed and deeply unreliable. The question of where Tizona went after El Cid's burial is not a simple one. It is a question with multiple competing answers, none of which is entirely satisfying, and the gap between them is where the real mystery lives. El Cid died in Valencia in July 1099. The city, surrounded by Almoravid forces and no longer defensible without its commander, was evacuated by his widow Jimena 2 years later. According to later accounts, Jimena carried her husband's body and his possessions, including his sword, back to Castile, where El Cid was eventually buried at the monastery of San Pedro de Cardeña, near Burgos. The earliest textual sources that mention Tizona by name are not contemporary with El Cid's life. They emerge from the epic and chronicle tradition that grew up around him in the 12th and 13th centuries. Most significantly from the Cantar de Mio Cid, the great Spanish epic poem whose composition date is itself debated, with estimates ranging from shortly after El Cid's death to well into the 13th century. In the Cantar, Tizona is presented as a sword of extraordinary virtue, one that terrifies unworthy opponents by its mere presence, that carries within its steel a kind of moral authority aligned with its owner's righteousness. This is literary. It is myth-making of a conscious and purposeful kind. But myth-making requires a referent. The Cantar's audience understood Tizona as a real object, something that existed in the world, that could in principle be seen and touched. The poem's power depended on that reality. So where was the sword when the poem was being recited? The historical record becomes complicated and contested at precisely this point. Various medieval sources claim that Tizona passed through different hands after El Cid's death, given as a gift by Jimena to the Castilian crown, held at San Pedro de Cardeña alongside the hero's tomb, presented to Alfonso VI of Castile as part of the settlement of El Cid's legacy. These accounts do not fully agree with one another, and some appear to have been constructed retrospectively to legitimize a particular institution's claim to the sword, rather than to document an actual chain of custody. This is a pattern that repeats itself throughout Tizona's documented history. Every major claimant to the sword's possession seems to have generated, or inherited, a narrative that traced ownership back to El Cid through a lineage conveniently aligned with their own dynastic interests. A sword held in the royal armory in Madrid was identified as Tizona for centuries, displayed, venerated, cited in royal inventories as the authentic weapon of the national hero. In 2007, metallurgical analysis was conducted on this sword. The results were intriguing and, to some, disappointing. The blade was dated to approximately the 11th century, consistent with El Cid's lifetime. But the hilt and grip were found to be significantly later additions, replacements made centuries after the blade's original forging. The mainstream interpretation of this finding is straightforward. Medieval swords were practical objects. Hilts wore out and were replaced. A blade surviving from the 11th century with a later hilt is entirely consistent with a weapon that was used, maintained, and periodically repaired over its working life. The 11th century blade, if authentic, is still a remarkable survival. But the finding opened a question that the authentication had been designed to close. If the hilt was replaced, when, by whom, and why? And if components were being replaced, what else might have been substituted? At what point does a restored object become a different object? And at what point does a different object become a convenient replacement for one that was lost? Some researchers have quietly raised the possibility that the sword in the Madrid armory, whatever its age and quality, may not be the weapon that El Cid carried at Valencia. That the original Tizona, if it survived the evacuation of the city at all, passed into a chain of custody that diverged from the official royal lineage at some point in the medieval period, and that the Madrid sword represents a later substitution, made at a moment when dynastic politics required a Tizona to exist in a particular place. There are medieval sources that describe a sword associated with El Cid in locations other than the Castilian royal collection. A tradition preserved in certain Aragonese chronicles suggests a different trajectory for the weapon entirely. These alternative accounts have not received the same scholarly attention as the Madrid sword's provenance, partly because the Madrid identification became so institutionally entrenched that questioning it felt, for a long time, like iconoclasm rather than scholarship. The plains of Castile that El Cid rode across in the 11th century have not changed in their fundamental character. Wide, dry, holding their silence under a sky of enormous clarity. The sword that he carried across them, the real one, the one in his hand at Valencia, the one that the Cantar says struck fear into those who faced it, may be in Madrid. Or it may be somewhere else entirely, unidentified, its history unread, waiting in a collection that has never thought to ask what it is actually holding. Some objects wait in collections, misidentified and unread. Others disappear into the momentum of history itself, carried away in the current of conquest so swift and so total that even the conquerors did not always know what they had taken. We leave the dry plains of Castile behind and travel now eastward again, back toward the vast interior of the Asian continent, to a world that the medieval West knew almost nothing about, and that modern popular history has still not fully absorbed. We travel to the forests and river valleys of Manchuria, the region stretching across what is now northeastern China, bordered by the Amur River to the north and the Korean Peninsula to the south, to the homeland of a people who would, in different centuries and under different names, shape the history of East Asia more profoundly than almost any other single ethnic group in the region. The Jurchen. They appear, vanish, reappear, and transform across 1,000 years of East Asian history with a consistency that feels almost deliberate. In the 12th century, they founded the Jin dynasty and destroyed the Liao Empire of the Khitai predecessors, a connection that threads back to an earlier part of this exploration. In the 17th century, reorganized and renamed as the Manchu, they would conquer China and establish the Qing dynasty that ruled until 1912. In between those two moments of imperial dominance, they existed in a state of fragmented, contested, periodically suppressed, but never fully extinguished political identity. And it is in one of those in-between moments, in the early 15th century, that the mystery we are concerned with begins. After the fall of the Jin dynasty to the Mongols in 1234, the Jurchen people did not disappear. They withdrew, back into the forests and river systems of Manchuria, back into the social structures of clan and tribe that had existed before the Jin imperial project imposed a different kind of organization over them. For the next 2 centuries, different Jurchen groups existed in varying degrees of relationship with, and resistance to, the successive powers that claimed authority over Manchuria. First, the Mongol Yuan dynasty, then the Chinese Ming dynasty that replaced it in 1368. The Ming relationship with the Jurchen was complex and carefully managed from the Chinese side. The Ming court established a system of administrative units across Manchuria, the Jianzhou and Haixi commanderies among the most significant, designed to incorporate Jurchen tribal leaders into a Chinese administrative hierarchy while preserving enough of the existing power structure to maintain stability. Jurchen chiefs were given Ming titles, Ming seals of authority, and access to the tributary trade system that connected the Manchurian forests to the wealth of the Chinese interior. Some of those chiefs accumulated considerable resources. The most powerful of the independent Jurchen leaders in the early 15th century operated from fortified settlements in the river valleys of the Changbai Mountains, the heavily forested highland region that forms the spine of the Manchurian-Korean border zone. These were not primitive chieftains. They were sophisticated political operators managing relationships with the Ming court, with Korean border administrators, with rival Jurchen factions, and with the trading networks that moved furs, ginseng, pearls, and horses across the region. Their wealth was real, their political intelligence considerable, and their material culture, what we can reconstruct of it, reflected a synthesis of Chinese, Korean, and indigenous Jurchen artistic traditions that was genuinely distinctive. It is the material culture that has gone missing. The historical record documents, through Ming court records and Korean border administrative documents, a series of gifts, tributes, and diplomatic exchanges between the most powerful Jurchen leaders of the early 15th century and the courts they dealt with. These records describe objects, not in great detail, but in sufficient outline to establish their significance. Ceremonial weapons inlaid with gold and silver, ritual vessels in bronze and jade, textiles of Chinese manufacture adapted to Jurchen ceremonial use, seals of authority in gold issued by the Ming court and held as the physical embodiment of political legitimacy. None of these objects have been conclusively identified in any museum collection or archaeological context. The early 15th century saw a period of intense conflict among Jurchen factions, partly fomented by Ming policy. The Chinese court was not interested in the emergence of a unified Jurchen political entity and managed inter-clan rivalry with considerable strategic sophistication. Several of the most powerful independent Jurchen leaders of this period were killed, some in inter-clan warfare, some in circumstances that suggest Ming involvement, and their settlements were destroyed or absorbed by rivals. In the destruction and dispersal that followed, the accumulated material wealth of these leaders, their ceremonial objects, their Ming-issued seals, the physical markers of their authority and their cultural identity, disappeared from the documentary record. The mainstream archaeological interpretation of this absence is pragmatic. Jurchen material culture of the early 15th century is poorly represented in museum collections globally because systematic archaeology of the relevant sites in Manchuria was not conducted until the 20th century, and the political circumstances of that region, contested between Chinese, Japanese, Soviet, and subsequently Chinese national archaeological priorities, meant that excavation was rarely conducted for purely scholarly reasons. Sites that might contain early 15th century Jurchen material have been excavated selectively, with results that have not always been fully published. What has been found in the excavations that have been conducted and reported is suggestive but incomplete. Settlement sites in the Changbai mountain region have yielded ceramics, metal objects, and architectural remains consistent with the early Ming period and with the kind of cultural synthesis the documentary sources describe. But the high-status objects, the ceremonial items, the gold seals, the diplomatic gifts that would represent the pinnacle of early Jurchen material culture, have not appeared in the excavated record in any quantity. There are several possible explanations for this, and they are not mutually exclusive. The simplest is destruction. Jurchen settlements that were overrun in the factional conflicts of the early 15th century were presumably looted, and looted material either enters circulation, passing into other collections, or is melted down for its raw material value. Gold seals issued by the Ming court were politically sensitive objects. A rival faction holding a dead leader's seal had strong incentives to either return it to the Ming court for reward or destroy it to prevent it from being used to legitimize a competing claim. The Ming court records do document the return of some seals following the deaths of Jurchen leaders, but the accounting is incomplete, and the records themselves acknowledge cases where seals were not recovered. Where did those seals go? And what accompanied them? The ceremonial objects, the accumulated tribute goods, the material heritage of a political identity that was being systematically dismantled. A second possibility, raised by researchers working from Korean border administrative documents, involves the movement of Jurchen material wealth into the Korean peninsula. The relationship between the Jurchen communities of the Changbai region and the Korean Joseon dynasty that came to power in 1392 was extensive and poorly documented from the Jurchen side. Korean border records describe Jurchen individuals and groups crossing into Korean territory throughout the early 15th century, sometimes as traders, sometimes as refugees from the interclan violence, sometimes in circumstances the Korean administrators found difficult to categorize. People crossing borders carry things. What some of those people carried has not been established. The third possibility is one that a small number of researchers have approached with appropriate caution, that some portion of the most significant Jurchen ceremonial material was deliberately concealed rather than lost to conflict or dispersal. The Changbai Mountains are extensive, densely forested, and contain a network of cave systems and natural concealed spaces that have not been systematically surveyed. A Jurchen leader facing the destruction of their political community, watching the Ming court's management of inter-clan rivalry reach its logical conclusion, had both the knowledge of the landscape and the motivation to place the most symbolically significant objects somewhere they could not be found by rivals or claimed by the Ming administration. Objects hidden with that intention, in that landscape, in the early 15th century, could still be there. The Changbai Mountains today straddle the border between China and North Korea, a geopolitical divide that has made systematic archaeological survey of the region essentially impossible for the better part of a century. The North Korean side of the border zone has seen almost no externally conducted archaeological work. The Chinese side has been surveyed, but not comprehensively, and the results of surveys that have been conducted are not always accessible to international scholarship. What this means, practically, is that a significant portion of the landscape most likely to contain early Jurchen material culture has been, and remains, effectively closed to investigation. The Jurchen who survived the conflicts of the early 15th century did not carry their history in objects. They carried it in memory, in clan structure, in the knowledge of who they were and where they came from. 2 centuries later, reorganized under a new name and a new political vision, they would conquer the largest empire in the world. But the objects that marked the moment before that transformation, the material evidence of what the last independent Jurchen leaders held, valued, and lost, remain somewhere in the silence between the forest and the river, waiting, as significant things tend to do, for circumstances to change enough that someone can finally go and look. Some things wait beneath forest floors, sealed in the silence of mountains that have kept their secrets for 8 centuries. Others wait in plain sight, in the architectural bones of monasteries still standing, in the genealogical records of dynasties still studied, and remain, despite that visibility, fundamentally unlocated. We leave the forested valleys of Manchuria behind and travel now back to Europe, to the southwestern corner of the continent, to a kingdom that most people outside of Spain and France have largely forgotten existed. We travel to the Kingdom of Navarre, a small but strategically significant medieval state occupying the Western Pyrenees and the approaches to the Iberian Peninsula from the north, a kingdom whose geographic position between the great powers of Castile, Aragon, and France gave it an outsized importance in the political calculations of the 12th and 13th centuries, and whose royal dynasty produced, in Sancho VII, one of the most physically imposing and historically interesting monarchs in medieval Iberian history. Sancho VII of Navarre, known as Sancho the Strong, ruled from 1194 to 1234. He was, by multiple contemporary accounts, a man of extraordinary physical stature, and the examination of his remains at the monastery of Roncesvalles has confirmed that he stood somewhere in the region of 7 feet tall, a height so exceptional that it became, in the chronicle tradition, a defining feature of his legendary status. He fought at the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212, one of the most decisive engagements of the Iberian Reconquista, where the combined Christian kingdoms of Iberia inflicted a catastrophic defeat on the Almohad Caliphate, the same dynasty whose lost library we explored earlier in this account. Sancho himself is buried at Roncesvalles in a tomb that has been studied, measured, and documented. His resting place is known. The resting places of his relatives are considerably less clear. The Navarrese royal family of the late 12th and early 13th centuries was, like all medieval dynasties, a network of strategic relationships, marriages, alliances, and carefully managed successions that connected the kingdom to the broader political world of Christian Iberia and southern France. Sancho VII was part of the Jimenez dynasty, a ruling house with roots extending back to the 10th century and connections through marriage to virtually every significant royal family in the Iberian Peninsula. The burial practices of this dynasty were not uniform. Different members were interred at different ecclesiastical institutions, a reflection of the political relationships those institutions represented as much as personal or familial preference. The monastery of Santa Maria la Real at Naira, the cathedral of Pamplona, various smaller religious houses scattered across the kingdom, all served at different points as repositories for the remains of Navarrese royalty. But the documentary record of exactly who was buried where, particularly for the collateral branches of the family and for the members who died in the turbulent decades surrounding Sancho's reign, is fragmentary in ways that have never been fully resolved. Several specific individuals, relatives of Sancho VII whose deaths are documented in chronicle sources, do not have confirmed burial locations. They appear in the historical record in life, sometimes quite vividly, and then disappear from it at death without the kind of institutional documentation that would specify where their remains were placed. This is not unusual for the medieval period. Burial records were kept by the institutions that received the remains: monasteries, cathedral chapters, parish churches, and those records were vulnerable to the same forces of loss and destruction that affected all medieval documentation: fire, flood, institutional dissolution, simple neglect over centuries. The reasons why a 13th century burial record might not survive are numerous and mundane, but there are specific aspects of the Navarrese case that push it beyond the ordinary pattern of archival loss. Navarre in the early 13th century was a kingdom under considerable political pressure. Sancho VII's long reign, he ruled for 40 years, was marked by a progressive isolation as the larger kingdoms surrounding him consolidated their power. The relationship between Sancho and his own nobility was frequently tense. There were periods when significant portions of the Navarrese aristocracy were in open or covert opposition to the king, and when the institutional infrastructure of the kingdom, including its ecclesiastical institutions, was navigating competing loyalties with considerable care. In that environment, the burial of individuals who were politically sensitive, relatives whose existence complicated succession questions, family members whose loyalty was ambiguous, individuals whose deaths occurred under circumstances that the official record preferred not to examine too closely, might have been managed in ways designed to avoid rather than create documentation. Medieval royal families had reasons, in specific circumstances, to bury their dead quietly. The monastery of Laer, in the foothills of the Pyrenees east of Pamplona, is the institution most frequently associated with the early Navarrese royal dynasty. It served as the dynastic pantheon for the earliest Jimenez kings, a function that gave it enormous symbolic significance and a documentary tradition extending back to the 10th century. Its crypt contains royal remains, some identified, some not, spanning several centuries of Navarrese history. Excavations conducted at Laer in the 20th century produced results that were, depending on the researcher interpreting them, either clarifying or deepening of the mystery. Several sets of remains were identified that did not correspond to the individuals named in the monastery's own burial records. The discrepancy between the physical evidence of interment and the documentary record of who was supposed to be there has not been comprehensively explained. Were these the remains of royal relatives buried without formal documentation? Were they individuals transferred to Laer from other locations during periods of political instability? Were they members of the extended Jimenez network whose burial at the dynastic monastery was kept off the official record for reasons the record itself does not disclose? The physical evidence says that someone was buried there who the documents do not acknowledge. The documentary evidence says that certain individuals died without confirmed burial locations. The overlap between those two observations has never been formally closed. There is another layer to this mystery that moves beyond the domestic politics of the Navarrese kingdom. Sancho VII's diplomatic reach was, for a ruler of a relatively small state, remarkable in its geographic ambition. He maintained relationships with Muslim rulers in North Africa, relationships that were commercial and diplomatic rather than purely military, and that involved a level of personal engagement unusual for a Christian Iberian monarch of the period. There is documentary evidence of Navarrese individuals traveling to North Africa in connection with these diplomatic activities, and of North African individuals traveling to Navarre. Some of those travelers died on the road. Where they were buried, the records do not consistently say. It is a smaller question than the fate of royal relatives, but it points toward the same underlying reality, that the Navarrese kingdom of the early 13th century was a place of more complex human movement and more varied cultural contact than its position in the standard historical narrative suggests, and that the physical record of the people who moved through it has not been fully recovered. The Pyrenean landscape that frames all of this history is not gentle. These are serious mountains, high, cold, subject to weather that makes the preservation of anything left unprotected a matter of chance rather than intention. Sites that might have served as burial locations in the early 13th century have been subject to 700 years of agricultural activity, construction, and erosion. The smaller religious houses that serve the Navarrese countryside, the ones below the level of the great monasteries, the ones whose own records are mostly lost, are in many cases known only as place names, their physical remains unlocated or unexcavated. Some of those small houses received royal dead. Which ones, and whose remains they hold, is a question that the available documentation cannot answer. The scholarship on Navarrese medieval history is, relative to the historiography of Castile or Aragon, limited. The kingdom's small size and its eventual absorption into the larger political structures of the Iberian Peninsula have meant that it receives less sustained research attention than its historical significance warrants. There are archives, in Pamplona, in the ecclesiastical collections of the Pyrenean monasteries, that have not been fully catalogued or cross-referenced against the genealogical questions that the mystery of the missing burials raises. Sancho the Strong lies in his great tomb at Roncesvalles, his extraordinary height a matter of confirmed physical record. His dynasty, his relatives, the people who shared his blood and his political world and his complicated moment in Iberian history, they are scattered across a landscape that has not yet been asked systematically and completely where it put them. The Pyrenees hold the border between France and Spain with the same indifference they have always maintained toward the human dramas that have played out at their feet. And somewhere in the shadow of those mountains, in a crypt or a field, or beneath the floor of a building whose original purpose has long been forgotten, the answer to the question of where Sancho's relatives were laid to rest may still be waiting for someone to look in the right place. The ground has not moved. The remains, wherever they are, have not gone anywhere. Only the knowledge of where to look has been lost. Some knowledge disappears into mountains that no longer remember what they were asked to hold. Other knowledge disappears into institutions, into the vast, complex, hierarchical machinery of organizations that were simultaneously military forces, medical establishments, banking networks, and religious orders, generating paperwork at every level and losing it at every transition. We leave the Pyrenean foothills behind and travel now southeastward, back toward the Mediterranean, back toward the contested coastal strip of the Levant that runs along the eastern shore of that sea, the land that medieval Europe called the Holy Land, and that we know today as the region of Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria. We have visited this geography before in this exploration, from different angles and for different reasons. We return to it now because something was built here that the historical record has never fully recovered. Not a physical structure, not a buried treasure, but a documentary archive of extraordinary scope and significance that existed, was maintained for nearly 2 centuries, and then fractured into pieces whose full dimensions have never been reassembled. The Knights Hospitaller arrived in the Levant before the First Crusade. Their origin was a hospital, a hospice for Christian pilgrims in Jerusalem, established by merchants from Amalfi sometime around 1023 AD, dedicated to St. John the Baptist, and staffed by Benedictine monks whose primary function was the care of the sick and the traveling poor. When the Crusaders took Jerusalem in 1099, the hospital was already there, already functioning, already embedded in the landscape of the city. Within 2 decades, the Hospitallers had transformed. The organization that had existed to care for the vulnerable became simultaneously an organization equipped and willing to fight for them. By 1113, the Hospital of St. John had received papal recognition as an independent religious order. By the middle of the 12th century, it was one of the most powerful military and financial institutions in the Crusader states, garrisoning castles, commanding armies, and maintaining the kind of sophisticated administrative infrastructure that a complex multinational organization required. That infrastructure generated records. Enormous quantities of them. The Hospitaller archive in the Levant was not a single repository, but a distributed network of documentation, maintained at the Order's headquarters as they moved over time from Jerusalem to Acre, spread across the commanderies and castles the Order held throughout the Crusader states, replicated in the network of Hospitaller houses that extended back into Europe. Charters, accounts, correspondence, registers of property and personnel, records of medical cases, inventories of military equipment, diplomatic communications with Muslim rulers, internal disciplinary proceedings. The full administrative life of an organization that was simultaneously running hospitals, managing estates, conducting warfare, and administering a transnational financial network. Some of this material survives. The Hospitaller archive that eventually reached Malta, where the Order retreated after the fall of Acre in 1291, and subsequently passed into the National Library of Malta and other repositories, is substantial and has been the subject of considerable scholarly study. It contains genuinely remarkable documentation stretching back to the 12th century. But it is not complete, and the gap between what survives and what should exist is, when examined carefully, very large. The fall of Acre in 1291 was not a gradual or managed event. It was a siege and a catastrophe. The Mamluk forces of Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil took the city in a military operation of sustained intensity, and the evacuation of the Crusader population was conducted under conditions of extreme pressure and violence. The Hospitallers held their headquarters at Acre until the final days of the siege, and the evacuation of their personnel, their sick, and whatever they could carry was managed under circumstances that made comprehensive archival transfer essentially impossible. What was taken was what could be taken. What remained was lost, to the Mamluks, to the general destruction of the city, to the sea. This is the mainstream explanation for the gap in the Hospitaller archive, and it is well-founded. Military catastrophe destroys records. The fall of Acre destroyed a great deal, but the gap is larger than the fall of Acre alone can account for. Researchers working systematically through the surviving Hospitaller documentation have identified categories of record that should exist, based on what the organization was doing, the administrative practices it demonstrably maintained, and the documentary traditions of comparable institutions, but do not appear in the surviving archive in the expected quantities. Financial records for specific periods, correspondence with specific parties, records of specific categories of property transaction in the Holy Land that the Order's known activities would have required. Some of this missing material may simply have been destroyed at Acre, but some of it predates the fall. It should have been copied, transmitted to Europe, preserved in the network of Western Hospitaller houses that maintained parallel archives. The absence of expected documentation from the European side of the archive suggests that certain categories of record were either never transmitted westward or were systematically removed at some point after transmission. The question of why specific categories of documentation might have been managed differently from others opens into some of the more sensitive aspects of Hospitaller history. The Order's relationships in the Levant were more complex than the simple narrative of Christian military resistance to Muslim expansion suggests. Like the Templars, the Hospitallers operated in an environment that required pragmatic engagement with the Muslim powers surrounding the Crusader states. Truces were negotiated, trade relationships were maintained. There is evidence, in the surviving documentation, of financial dealings that crossed religious lines, transactions involving Muslim merchants, arrangements with Muslim rulers, forms of commercial and diplomatic contact that the Order's official self-presentation as a military force of Christian defense did not fully acknowledge. The full extent of these relationships, whatever their nature and scale, would have been documented. The documentation would have been sensitive, and sensitive documentation in a medieval religious and military order was documentation that the organization had strong institutional reasons to manage carefully. This is not to suggest deliberate large-scale destruction of records, but medieval archives were not neutral repositories. They were managed by people with interests, and decisions about what to copy, what to transmit, what to store in accessible locations, and what to place in less accessible ones were made by those people in light of those interests. There is a specific category of missing documentation that several researchers have focused on with particular attention. The Hospitallers maintained, throughout their presence in the Levant, an extensive network of informants and intelligence contacts, a function that was essential to military organizations operating in hostile territory and that generated its own documentary trail. Reports, assessments, communications with local contacts, records of information received and acted upon. This intelligence material would have been among the most sensitive in the entire archive. It named people, Muslim officials, local merchants, intermediaries of various kinds, whose identification as sources of information to the Crusader orders would have had potentially fatal consequences for them if the documents fell into the wrong hands. The management of this material would have been different from the management of routine administrative records. Where it went, whether it was destroyed as a matter of policy, hidden in locations separate from the main archive, or simply lost in the various catastrophes that affected the Order's records, is not known. The castle of Croc des Chevaliers, the great Hospitaller fortress in what is now Syria, fell to the Mamluk forces of Baybars in 1271, 2 decades before the fall of Acre. It was one of the most significant Hospitaller military installations in the Levant, garrisoned, administered, and documented for over a century and a half. The records generated by the administration of Croc des Chevaliers during that period are almost entirely absent from the surviving archive. Archaeological work at Croc has revealed the physical structure of the castle in remarkable detail, the layers of construction, the systems of water management, the spatial organization of a fortress that was essentially a self-contained administrative and military complex. But the documents that recorded the daily life of that complex, the correspondence that connected it to the Order's headquarters and to the European network, the financial records of its administration, these have not been found. They were either evacuated before the castle fell, in which case they should appear somewhere in the surviving archive and do not, or they were left behind and captured by the Mamluks, in which case they entered a documentary tradition that has not yet yielded them to scholarship. The Mamluk administration that replaced the Crusader order in the Levant was itself sophisticated and archivally active. The possibility that captured Hospitaller documentation entered Mamluk administrative collections, and from there passed into the Ottoman archives that succeeded the Mamluk state, is one that scholars of the period have raised but not been able to confirm. The Ottoman archives in Istanbul are vast, incompletely catalogued, and contain material in multiple languages whose full contents remain unknown to scholarship. Somewhere in that vastness, or in the rubble of what was not preserved, the administrative life of the Hospitallers in the Levant, the full record of what they did and who they dealt with and what they knew in 2 centuries of operation in Palestine, still waits to be accounted for. The order that began as a hospital, as an act of care for the sick and the displaced, generated a documentary record commensurate with its ambition and its complexity. Most of it is gone, but gone in history rarely means gone forever. It means not yet found. Some records are not yet found. Others were never written, carried instead in the memory of descendants who remember, in their own ways and on their own terms, what the documents cannot say. We leave the Mediterranean coast and the archival silences of the Hospitaller order behind, and we cross the Atlantic now, westward, into a hemisphere that medieval Europe was only beginning to suspect existed, to a landscape as different from the coastal Levant as it is possible to imagine. We travel to the Colorado Plateau, to the high desert country of what is now the American Southwest, Utah, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, where the land rises in great stepped formations of red and ochre sandstone, where the sky is enormous and the distances are deceptive, and where the silence, on a windless day, has a quality that feels less like absence and more like presence. It is a landscape that has been continuously inhabited for thousands of years. And around 1200 AD, in a development that archaeology has documented but not fully explained, several of the most significant and most elaborately constructed communities in that landscape were left behind. The people we call the ancestral pueblo, a term preferred by contemporary Pueblo peoples over the older and now avoided designation, had been building in the American Southwest for centuries before the abandonments of the late 12th and early 13th centuries. Their architectural achievement was extraordinary by any measure. At Chaco Canyon in what is now northwestern New Mexico, they had constructed between approximately 850 and 1150 AD a complex of great houses, massive multi-story structures of carefully dressed sandstone containing hundreds of rooms, arranged across the canyon floor in a spatial pattern that appears to encode astronomical alignments, and to anchor a network of roads extending outward across the desert for hundreds of kilometers. Pueblo Bonito, the largest of the Chaco Great Houses, contained at its peak an estimated 650 rooms and rose to 4 or 5 stories in height. It was, at the time of its construction, the largest building in North America. The engineering precision of its construction, walls aligned to solstice sunrise and sunset, rooms positioned to receive light at specific times of year, speaks to a level of astronomical and architectural knowledge that was the product of generations of accumulated expertise. Chaco began to decline around 1150 AD, and by the late 12th century, the great houses were largely empty. The focus of ancestral Pueblo activity had shifted northward to the Mesa Verde region of what is now southwestern Colorado, a high forested plateau cut by deep canyons, where a new and distinct architectural tradition was emerging. The cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde are perhaps the most visually arresting architectural achievement of the pre-Columbian North American world. Built into the natural alcoves of the canyon walls, sheltered overhangs of sandstone that provided protection from rain and, perhaps, from other threats. Communities of considerable size were constructed with a precision and a compactness that used every available space. Cliff Palace, the largest cliff dwelling in North America, contained over 150 rooms and 23 kivas, the circular semi-subterranean ceremonial chambers that were central to Pueblo religious practice. It housed at its peak an estimated 100 to 150 people. It was built, occupied intensively, and abandoned within a period of approximately 75 to 100 years. The abandonment of Mesa Verde and the surrounding region occurred in the final decades of the 13th century, with most sites empty by approximately 1300 AD, and many showing signs of departure considerably earlier. The scale of the departure was total. People did not trickle away over generations. The archaeological evidence suggests a relatively rapid community-wide movement out of a landscape that had supported dense habitation for centuries. Where they went is partially known. The descendants of the ancestral Pueblo are the modern Pueblo peoples of New Mexico and Arizona, and their oral traditions carry memory of the migrations southward and eastward that brought their ancestors to the Rio Grande Valley and the high mesas of the Hopi country. This is not a mystery of disappearance in the way that some vanished cultures present themselves. The people did not cease to exist. They moved. The question that archaeology and oral tradition have not yet answered with complete satisfaction is why. And why then? And why so completely? The mainstream explanation is environmental, and it is well supported by the physical evidence. A severe and prolonged drought struck the Colorado Plateau in the last quarter of the 13th century. The Great Drought, as it has been called, dated by tree ring analysis to approximately 1276 to 1299 AD. In a landscape where water was always the limiting factor, a drought of that duration and severity would have made the existing settlement patterns unsustainable. Agricultural systems that had been carefully managed for generations would have failed. The social and political structures that depended on surplus production would have been placed under impossible strain. The drought explanation is compelling, and for many researchers, it is sufficient. But the abandonment of some Mesa Verde sites begins earlier than the Great Drought, in the period around 1200 AD, when the cliff dwellings were being constructed with particular intensity, and when, by most environmental measures, conditions had not yet reached the critical threshold that the drought hypothesis requires. Sites in the northern San Juan region show evidence of departure in the early 13th century, before the tree ring record indicates severe drought conditions. Something was happening around 1200 that the drought alone does not explain. The archaeological record of the early 13th century ancestral Pueblo world shows other patterns alongside the environmental stress. Evidence of violence, not universal, not defining the entire period, but present in specific sites and specific deposits, has been documented at several locations in the Four Corners region. Skeletal assemblages showing traumatic injury, architectural modifications suggesting defensive concern, the blocking of doorways, the removal of access routes to cliff dwellings, the repositioning of communities to naturally defensible locations. The cliff-dwelling form itself, with its inaccessibility and its commanding views of the approaches, has been interpreted by some researchers as a response to threat rather than simply an adaptation to available shelter. What was the nature of that threat, and where did it originate? The answers are genuinely contested. Some researchers point to internal social stress, the breakdown of the Chacoan system, which had organized the distribution of resources across a wide network, creating conditions of competition and conflict among communities that had previously been connected by that network's integrating function. The collapse of Chaco was not merely the abandonment of a place. It was the dissolution of a social and economic system, and the communities left in its wake were navigating a world in which the old patterns of exchange and obligation no longer held. Others have pointed to the arrival of new populations moving into the Colorado Plateau from the north. Ancestral Numic-speaking peoples, or others whose archaeological signature has not been clearly identified, whose presence in the region may have introduced new competitive pressures for the resources that the drought was simultaneously diminishing. The ancestral Pueblo peoples themselves, through the living descendants who carry the memory of these events in oral tradition, offer perspectives that archaeology has not always known how to integrate into its frameworks. Hopi oral traditions speak of migrations undertaken in response to spiritual as much as material imperatives. Movements made because the covenant between a community and its place had been broken, because the signs indicated that continuation in a particular location was no longer sanctioned, because the world required renewal through movement. These are not explanations that map neatly onto environmental or demographic models, but they are not incompatible with them either. A people experiencing drought, violence, and social dissolution might understand those conditions in spiritual terms, as evidence that something had gone wrong in the relationship between the human and the sacred, requiring a departure and a reorientation that was simultaneously practical and cosmological. The kivas at Cliff Palace were sealed before the community left. Ritual objects were placed in specific locations. The departure, wherever it was driven by, was not chaotic. It was managed. It had a form that suggests intention rather than panic. What that intention was, what the community understood itself to be doing as it left behind the extraordinary structures it had built, is something that the stones of Mesa Verde record only in their silence. The cliff dwellings still stand in the canyon walls of Colorado, preserved by the same dry air that made the plateau habitable and then made it untenable. They look to the visitor who sees them for the first time, as if they were left yesterday. the walls intact, the kiva roofs gone but the circular chambers still readable, the fingerprints of the masons still visible in the mortar between the stones. The people who left them carried their knowledge with them. Their descendants still hold it. The full conversation between what the stones record and what the oral traditions remember has not yet happened in the way that it needs to. And in that gap, between the archaeology and the living memory, between the environmental data and the human meaning, the real explanation for what happened around 1200 on the Colorado Plateau may still be waiting to be heard. Some answers wait in the space between living memory and stone. Others wait beneath water, in the particular darkness of the deep ocean, where the pressure is absolute and the silence is older than anything built on land. We leave the canyon walls of the Colorado Plateau behind and travel now in a direction that the ancestral pueblo never went. Southward and eastward, across the Pacific, across the Indian subcontinent, to the southeastern coast of India, to a shoreline of flat, fertile delta land where great rivers meet the Bay of Bengal in a tangle of distributaries and mangrove and warm, shallow water the color of milky jade. This is the Coromandel Coast. And from this shoreline, between roughly the 9th and 13th centuries AD, one of the most extraordinary maritime empires in human history projected its power across the Indian Ocean world with a reach and a sophistication that Western historiography has been consistently slow to acknowledge. The Chola Empire at its peak was not a coastal kingdom dabbling in occasional overseas adventure. It was a genuinely maritime power, a state whose wealth, whose political identity, and whose imperial ambitions were all fundamentally oriented toward the sea. Its trading networks extended from the Persian Gulf to the South China Sea. Its diplomatic relationships touched the courts of China, Southeast Asia, and the Arab world simultaneously. And its military capacity at sea was demonstrated in 1025 AD when the Chola king Rajendra I launched a naval expedition of extraordinary scale against the Srivijaya Empire of Southeast Asia, a campaign that struck targets across the Malay Peninsula and the islands of Sumatra and Java, covering thousands of kilometers of open ocean with a coordinated military force. This was not a raid. It was a projection of imperial power across the entire width of the eastern Indian Ocean. The fleet that made such operations possible was the foundation of Chola, wealth and authority. And the wealth that fleet carried, the accumulated tribute, trade goods, and royal treasury that moved through the Chola maritime network, represented a concentration of value that has, in specific and documented instances, simply vanished from the historical record. The Chola imperial treasury was not a static deposit. It was a living, moving system, gold, silver, gems, and luxury goods flowing inward from the empire's trade networks and outward in the form of temple donations, military expenditure, diplomatic gifts, and the funding of further commercial ventures. The great temples of the Chola heartland, Brihadiswara at Thanjavur, Gangaikonda Cholapuram, Dharasuram, were not only religious monuments. They were treasury institutions, repositories of imperial wealth expressed in the form of bronze sculpture, golden ritual objects, and endowment lands whose revenues sustained the temple establishment. What those temples held at the height of Chola power was, by any measure, enormous. The bronze casting tradition of the Chola period, the Nataraja, the processional images of Shiva and Vishnu and their consorts, represents the finest metalwork of the medieval world by many assessments. Thousands of bronzes were produced across the centuries of Chola rule. Many survive, scattered across museum collections from Chennai to Paris to New York. Many more do not. The question of the missing Chola maritime treasure is not a single event with a single explanation. It is a pattern, a recurring disappearance of documented wealth that the historical record notes and then fails to account for across several distinct episodes. The most significant of these episodes centers on the decline of the Chola Empire in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. Pressed from the north by the Hoysala and Pandya kingdoms, weakened by succession disputes and the gradual erosion of the tributary network that had sustained its maritime dominance, the Chola state contracted across several decades until its final absorption by the Pandyas in the late 13th century. Contracting empires move their wealth. The administrative logic of a state facing military pressure and territorial loss requires the consolidation of portable assets. Their movement away from vulnerable frontiers and toward secure locations, or their liquidation into forms that can be more easily protected or transported. The Chola court, in its final century, was doing exactly this. The documentary evidence, temple inscriptions, copper plate grants, the records of donations and withdrawals from temple treasuries, shows a pattern of asset movement that historians have traced only partially. Donations to certain temples decline. References to specific categories of royal treasure disappear from the inscription record. The maritime trading network, which had been the engine of Chola wealth for 3 centuries, shows signs of contraction and redirection in ways that the surviving commercial documentation does not fully explain. Where was the wealth going? The mainstream historical answer is dispersal, the natural fragmentation of a centralized treasury as the central authority weakens, with assets absorbed by the successor states, by temple institutions operating with increasing autonomy, by the merchant communities whose commercial activities had always been partly independent of royal control. This is a reasonable model for how imperial wealth typically behaves in periods of political decline. But the maritime dimension of the Chola case introduces a variable that purely land-based models of imperial decline do not account for. The Chola fleet, or the merchant fleet operating under Chola protection, the distinction between royal and commercial maritime activity being less clear than it might appear, was, in the late 12th century, still operational across routes that extended to Southeast Asia and beyond. Ships were still moving, and ships that are moving can carry things to places that land-based successor states cannot easily reach or recover. Several researchers working on the archaeology of Southeast Asian maritime trade have noted concentrations of Chola period material, bronzes, gold objects, inscribed copper plates, in locations along the trade routes that the Chola network used, dated to the period of the empire's decline. Some of this material appears in temple contexts in what is now Thailand, Cambodia, and the Indonesian archipelago. Donations or deposits made by communities with Chola connections who were receiving or safeguarding objects of Chola origin. The pattern is not comprehensive enough to support a definitive conclusion, but it suggests the possibility that a portion of the Chola maritime treasury was not lost in the chaos of political collapse, but deliberately dispersed along the trade routes, sent to trusted partners, deposited in temple institutions beyond the reach of the successor states, or simply kept in motion on vessels that continued operating after the land-based empire had ceased to exist as a coherent political entity. Maritime wealth is the most mobile kind. It has no fixed address. It follows the routes that commerce has always followed, indifferent to the political transformations happening on shore. There is also the literal dimension of the missing fleet. Ships sink. The Coromandel coast and the waters of the Bay of Bengal and the Strait of Malacca are among the most historically trafficked maritime zones in the world, and the underwater archaeology of those waters is in its earliest stages. Systematic survey of the seafloor along the Chola trade routes has not been conducted with the technology now available for deep water archaeological investigation. What lies on the seafloor along those routes, the accumulated losses of 3 centuries of intensive maritime commerce, including the specific losses of the Chola imperial period, is genuinely unknown. The Bay of Bengal is not a shallow sea. Its depths, in places, exceed 4 kilometers. At those depths, organic material does not survive, but metal does. Bronze survives. Gold survives. The great Chola bronzes, the missing ones, the ones that left the inscription record and did not appear in any known collection, are dense enough, in the right conditions, to survive on the seafloor indefinitely. The underwater archaeology of South and Southeast Asia has produced in recent decades finds that have rewritten assumptions about the scale and sophistication of pre-modern maritime trade in the region. Wrecks off the coast of Java, in the waters of the South China Sea, along the Sri Lankan coast, have yielded cargo assemblages of extraordinary richness. Tang Dynasty ceramics, Islamic glass, Indian metalwork, moving together in vessels that cross the entire width of the Indian Ocean world in a single voyage. None of those wrecks has yet been identified as Chola Imperial in origin, but the absence of identification is not the same as the absence of the ships. The Coromandel coast today is a landscape of fishing communities and industrial development. The ancient delta geography partially transformed, the shoreline shifted by centuries of sedimentation and human modification. The great Chola temples still stand inland, their towers rising above the flat Tamil plain, their bronze treasuries a fraction of what the inscription record suggests they once held. The sea in front of them keeps its own inventory. Somewhere between the shore and the horizon, in the water that the Chola fleet knew better than any other maritime power of its age, the account of what the empire accumulated and where it ultimately went has not yet been fully rendered. The ocean is patient. It has been keeping that account for 800 years. It has not yet presented the bill. Some accounts are rendered in water and bronze, patient and submerged. Others are rendered in stone and light, raised into the sky with a precision that still, after 9 centuries, stops the breath of anyone who looks up at the right moment from the right angle inside the right building. We leave the warm waters of the Bay of Bengal behind and travel now to northern France. To the Ile-de-France, the royal heartland of the Capetian monarchy, to a landscape of wheat fields and river valleys and modest rolling hills that gives no obvious indication, from the outside, of what was happening inside its stone buildings in the middle decades of the 12th century. What was happening was one of the most significant architectural revolutions in human history. Between approximately 1130 and 1200 AD, a new way of building emerged in the region around Paris. A system of structural innovation so radical in its implications and so rapidly developed in its execution that historians of architecture have been debating its origins ever since. The pointed arch, the ribbed vault, the flying buttress, 3 structural elements that, used in combination, solved a problem that Romanesque architecture had been unable to solve for centuries. How to build a stone building of great height with walls thin enough to admit light in quantities sufficient to transform the interior experience of the space from something heavy and earthbound into something that felt, to the medieval mind, like a physical approximation of heaven. The first building to deploy these elements in a fully integrated way was the choir of the Abbey of Saint-Denis, outside Paris, rebuilt under the direction of Abbot Suger between 1140 and 1144. What Suger created, or more precisely, what the craftsmen working under his patronage created, was a space in which the walls between the structural supports were dissolved almost entirely into glass, flooding the interior with colored light in a way that no previous European building had achieved. Suger himself left extensive written accounts of the rebuilding. He described his intentions, his theological justifications, his delight in the finished result. He wrote about the light. He wrote about the jeweled appearance of the windows. He wrote about the spiritual meaning of luminosity as a path to the divine. He did not write in any systematic way about the people who actually built it. This is the central and enduring mystery of early Gothic architecture. The revolution happened. Its results are physically present, measurable, analyzable in extraordinary detail by modern structural engineers and art historians. But the people who conceived and executed the specific technical innovations that made it possible, the master masons and craftsmen who solved, in stone and mortar and timber scaffolding, the structural problems that the new aesthetic demanded, remain almost entirely anonymous. We know Suger. We do not know his builders. This is not entirely surprising in the context of medieval historical practice. The patrons of great buildings, the abbots, bishops, and kings who commissioned them and whose resources made them possible, were the figures the chronicle tradition celebrated. The craftsmen who executed the work occupied a social position that medieval historiography did not generally consider worth recording. Their names, their origins, their training, and the specific intellectual processes by which they arrived at the innovations they achieved were not the kinds of things that literate observers of the period thought to document. But the silence is deeper than the general patterns of medieval record-keeping alone can explain. The Gothic innovation did not emerge from a single building or a single workshop. In the decades following Saint-Denis, a cluster of new buildings in the Ile-de-France region deployed and developed the new structural system with a rapidity that implies not just individual genius, but a community of practice, a network of craftsmen who were sharing knowledge, building on each other's solutions, and pushing the structural possibilities of the new system with a collective intelligence whose organizational form is entirely unknown. The cathedrals of Sens, Senlis, Noyon, Lyon, and Paris, begun in rapid succession in the third quarter of the 12th century, each represent distinct contributions to the developing Gothic system. Each solves problems that the previous buildings had left unresolved, and each introduces elements that subsequent buildings will take up and develop further. The conversation between these buildings is unmistakable. The identity of the people conducting that conversation is not. The mainstream art historical approach to this problem is methodologically careful. It focuses on what can be recovered, the physical evidence of the buildings themselves, the patterns of tool marks and construction techniques that allow researchers to identify the work of specific workshops, the documentary fragments that occasionally preserve a name or a detail. From this evidence, the outlines of certain individual careers can be partially reconstructed. The so-called Villard de Honnecourt, whose 13th century portfolio of architectural drawings survives in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, gives us a rare glimpse into the intellectual world of a medieval master craftsman, though Villard's specific professional identity and the buildings he worked on are themselves matters of scholarly debate. The portfolio is a window, but it is a small window, and it opens onto the 13th century, rather than the period of the original innovation. For the master craftsmen of the 1140s to 1180s, the generation that actually invented early Gothic architecture, the documentary record is close to empty. Several researchers have approached this problem from the angle of technical knowledge transmission. The innovations of early Gothic architecture were not simple improvements on existing practice. They required a level of understanding of structural mechanics, the behavior of stone under load, the distribution of thrust through arched forms, the relationship between foundation depth and wall height, that went significantly beyond the empirical rule-of-thumb knowledge that traditional masonry practice accumulated through repetition and inherited technique. Where did this understanding come from, and how was it transmitted between the workshops that were developing the new system simultaneously across the Île-de-France? One line of research has focused on the possibility of knowledge transfer from outside the Western European Mason tradition, specifically from the Islamic architectural world, which had been developing sophisticated vaulting systems, pointed arch forms, and complex geometric structural organization for centuries before the Gothic emergence. The pointed arch itself was not a Gothic invention. It appears in Islamic architecture from the 7th century onward, and in the Romanesque architecture of southern France and Norman Sicily, both regions in intensive contact with Islamic building traditions. Whether specific craftsmen with experience of Islamic architectural practice were involved in the early Gothic workshops of northern France is not documented, but the geographic and cultural connections that would have made such transfer possible, through the Crusader states, through Sicily, through the trading connections of the Mediterranean, were all active in the relevant period. There is a further possibility that a small number of researchers have raised with the caution it deserves. The rapid coordinated development of Gothic structural innovation across multiple simultaneous building sites in the Île-de-France suggests a degree of organized knowledge sharing that the purely informal model of craftsmen moving between sites does not fully account for. Some historians have proposed the existence of more formally organized networks, lodges or confraternities of master masons, operating with a degree of institutional coherence that left no direct documentary trace, but whose existence would explain the pattern of simultaneous innovation more satisfactorily than purely individual or informal transmission. The lodge system of later medieval and early modern masonry is documented. The operative masons' lodges of the 14th and 15th centuries are attested in guild records and building accounts. Whether analogous organizations existed in the mid-12th century, in the decades of the original Gothic Revolution, is not known. The documentary silence of that period on matters of craftsman organization could reflect the absence of such structures, or it could reflect the ordinary invisibility of working people in the records that the literate elite chose to keep. Stand inside the choir of Saint-Denis on a morning when the light is right. when the sun is at an angle that sends colored shafts through the ambulatory windows, and the stone seems almost to dissolve in the luminosity that Suger described with such theological precision. The experience is, even now, even knowing everything that architecture history has established about how the effect was achieved, genuinely arresting. Someone designed this. Someone looked at the structural problem, how to hold up a stone vault on supports thin enough to allow this much glass, and found an answer that had not existed before. Someone taught that answer to others, and those others carried it to Sens and Noyon and Laon and Paris, and the landscape of northern France was permanently changed. We know the buildings. We know the patrons who commissioned them and the theologians who justified them. We do not know the names of the people who actually figured out how to make them stand. They built structures that have lasted 9 centuries and show every sign of lasting 9 centuries more. They achieved this without leaving a single verified name attached to the innovation that changed the world they lived in. The stones remember the geometry. They do not remember the hands. Some hands leave their mark in stone, in geometry, in the precise language of structural engineering. Others leave their mark in the earth itself, in burial mounds and sacred enclosures, in the deliberate return of powerful bodies to the ground that produced them, and then efface that mark with the same intentionality with which it was made. We leave the soaring stone interiors of northern France behind and travel now in the most extreme possible direction. Away from the vertical ambition of Gothic architecture, away from the built environment entirely, into a landscape that defines itself precisely by the absence of permanent construction. We travel to the eastern steppe, to the great rolling grasslands of what is now Mongolia and the Russian borderlands, to a world of horizontal distances so vast that the sky occupies more of the visual field than the earth, where the wind moves continuously and the grass bends in patterns that look, from a certain angle, like something breathing. This is a landscape that produces a particular relationship with impermanence. The people who have lived here across the millennia have understood, in ways that sedentary civilizations rarely do, that the most durable things are not the ones that resist the earth, but the ones that return to it cleanly. The Mongols buried their dead to disappear. This was not carelessness. It was philosophy. A deliberate practice rooted in a cosmological understanding of the relationship between the living, the dead, and the land they shared. The graves of powerful individuals were concealed with a thoroughness that subsequent centuries have confirmed was genuinely effective. Horses were driven over the burial site to obliterate surface traces. In some accounts, the mourners who knew the location were killed to ensure their silence. Rivers were diverted to flow over the grave, then returned to their original courses. Trees were planted. The land was returned to itself. The tomb of Genghis Khan himself, who died in 1227, has never been found, despite being one of the most sought archaeological sites in the world. That absence is famous, discussed, the subject of ongoing and sophisticated search efforts using satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and every tool that modern technology makes available. Less discussed, but in some ways more intriguing, is the question of what lies beneath the Mongolian steppe from the centuries before Genghis Khan. The graves of the ancestral lineages from which he descended, the burial places of the chiefs and shamans and war leaders whose accumulated history produced the conditions in which a man like Temujin could emerge and become something the world had never seen. The genealogical traditions preserved in the secret history of the Mongols, the remarkable 13th century text that is the primary indigenous source for early Mongol history, trace Genghis Khan's ancestry back through a line of named forebears extending for 10 generations or more before his birth. These are not mythological figures in the way that the founding ancestors of other dynastic traditions tend to be. They are presented with the specificity of real people, with named wives and children, with documented conflicts and alliances, with deaths that occurred in identified circumstances. They were real. They lived. They died. They were buried somewhere in the landscape of what is now Mongolia. And not one of those burial sites has been confirmed by archaeology. The mainstream explanation for this absence begins with the burial practices themselves. If the Mongols were as thorough in concealing graves as the historical and ethnographic record suggests, then the absence of identified ancestral tombs is exactly what we should expect. The concealment was the point. The landscape was designed to yield nothing. This is a complete and internally consistent explanation. It may be the correct one, but the period in question, the 10th, 11th, and early 12th centuries, the generations immediately preceding Genghis Khan, was not a period of monolithic cultural uniformity on the Mongolian steppe. The ancestors of the Mongols existed within a complex of competing tribal and ethnic groups, Tatars, Merkits, Karites, Naimans, each with its own cultural practices, its own relationships with the surrounding sedentary civilizations, and its own approach to the treatment of the dead. The Karites, for example, a powerful steppe confederation with whom Genghis Khan's ancestors had complex and sometimes violent relationships, were Nestorian Christians. Their burial practices would have been shaped by a different set of beliefs about the body and its relationship to the afterlife. The Naimans had connections to Buddhist traditions filtering in from the south and west. The steppe of the pre-Mongol period was not culturally isolated. It was in continuous contact with China to the south, with the Islamic world to the west, with the forest cultures of Siberia to the north, and those contacts left traces in material culture, in religious practice, and in the treatment of the dead. Some of those traces should be archaeologically recoverable. Some of them have been. The steppe archaeology of Mongolia and southern Siberia has documented burial traditions across a wide range of periods, from the Bronze Age through the Turk Empire of the 6th to 8th centuries. The material is rich and the scholarship is growing, but the specific period of the immediate Mongol ancestors, roughly 950 to 1200 AD, is represented in the confirmed archaeological record with a sparseness that specialists in the field find notable. The burials that have been found and attributed to this period are modest, containing little material wealth, and none has been connected with the named lineages of the secret history tradition. There are several possible explanations for this sparseness, and they point in different directions. The first is simply the concealment hypothesis extended. Not just the great leaders were hidden, but the entire cultural practice of the period was oriented away from the kind of monumental burial that leaves recoverable archaeological traces. Unlike the earlier steppe empires, which built large kurgans, burial mounds visible from great distances, the Mongol ancestral tradition may have been systematically oriented toward invisibility. The second is a research gap. Mongolia is a large country with a small population and a relatively limited archaeological infrastructure. Systematic survey of the steppe, particularly in the regions of the Khenti Mountains and the upper Onan and Kurlan River valleys, the heartland of the Mongol ancestral homeland described in the secret history, has been conducted but not comprehensively. The logistical challenges are real. The terrain is difficult. The seasons during which fieldwork is possible are short. The third possibility is that the burial sites exist and have been found, but not identified. The archaeological record of the pre-Mongol period is, in many cases, assigned to broader cultural categories that may subsume Mongol ancestral material within designations that obscure its specific identity. Without the kind of comparative material culture baseline that would allow confident attribution of a specific burial to the lineages named in the secret history, a grave that belonged to one of Genghis Khan's great-great-grandfathers might sit in a museum catalog assigned to a generic steppe nomad tradition, its significance entirely invisible. There is also a dimension to this mystery that involves the living as much as the dead. For contemporary Mongolians, the burial places of the Mongol ancestral lineages are not merely archaeological questions. They are matters of cultural and spiritual significance, sites that, if found, would be places of veneration, of national identity, of connection to a history that the Mongolian people carry with extraordinary intensity. The question of whether those sites should be excavated, if found, whether the imperative of archaeological knowledge should outweigh the imperative of leaving the dead undisturbed in the manner their culture intended, is one that the Mongolian government and the scholarly community have been navigating with considerable care. The sacred mountain of Burkhan Khaldun, in the Khenti range of northeastern Mongolia, is identified in the secret history as a place of profound significance to Genghis Khan personally, a location where he sought refuge as a young man, where he prayed before his campaigns, and which he designated as sacred. It is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, protected from excavation not only by Mongolian law, but by the explicit wishes of the Mongolian state and many of its people. Whether Burkhan Khaldun and its surrounding landscape contains the graves of the ancestral lineages is not known. The protection of the site means that the question cannot be answered by the methods that would most directly address it. And this is perhaps the most honest place at which to rest with this particular mystery, not with the frustration of knowledge withheld, but with the recognition that some questions are held by the people most directly connected to them, and that the answer, if it exists, belongs first to them. The steppe grass bends in the wind above the Khenti mountains. The rivers that Genghis Khan's ancestors drank from still run cold from the mountain snowfields. The land that produced the most consequential conqueror in human history has kept the memory of his forebears in the only way a landscape can, by remaining exactly what it is and saying nothing.